Chapter 400. There must have been a difference of heaven and earth between the initial stage of the Great Sage realm and the Great Sage complete realm. However, he had still been put into such a distressed situation by Bai Jian-song. He had lost face because of this. So, he felt humiliated. His complexion had also turned exceptionally unsightly. However, he couldn't give much thought to this right now. He coldly looked at Bai Jian-song and said, "The higher authorities have agreed for this fight. It doesn't matter whether your hidden star peak agrees or not." His voice thundered like the sound of a big bell. It shook many of the spectating experts. They staggered a little since they couldn't stand steadily. This was a terrifying senior expert of the Great Sage realm. Even a breath of his could blow them away and kill a group of people in one fell swoop. The eyes of the Clear Sky Peak's senior elder turned ice-cold as he looked at Yi Shiwen. His gaze was exceptionally cold. He originally wouldn't have gone as far as to personally get involved in this mess. However, nobody could harmonize this conflict between the second god and Yi Shiwen. These two individuals weren't fighting to attain hegemony in the younger generation. Rather, they were mortal enemies. One of them would inevitably have to die. So, the Clear Sky Peak could only support its own disciple under these circumstances. The Clear Sky Peak had paid an incredible price in order to get the high-level experts' approval that had allowed them to show their support towards the second god. The second god possessed the blood of the Titan race. He would have incredible future prospects. In fact, he had even been assigned the position of the chief disciple. They had high hopes from the second god. It was a known fact that the true martial university recruited disciples once in 100 years. Moreover, there was no lack of Heaven's Pride level experts among these new disciples. And, the Clear Sky Peak was ranked among the top 10 inheritances. Many Heaven's Pride level experts would often choose to join one of these top inheritances. The Clear Sky Peak had only seen 3 Heaven's Pride level experts join their ranks in this millennium, and all of them had already entered the Sage realm at the time of their joining. However, they had finally selected the second god, and had assigned him the position of the chief. One could imagine his value in their eyes. However, the second god had this kind of a mortal enemy. So, it was worth it to spend some more to help him get rid of this enemy. It was better than offending some old and stubborn high-level expert. Not many people would be offended anyway. However, every member of Hidden Star Peak wanted to settle this dispute for Yi Ziwen's sake. However, he wouldn't let anybody interfere in this battle. In fact, he himself wouldn't intervene. One mustn't disturb this fight between the disciples regardless of its outcome. Moreover, he didn't need to interfere because the second god had already obtained the victor's position. Bullshit. I don't care what your higher-ups have agreed to. Damn it all. You've dared to aim for a person of our Hidden Star Peaks, and it is only to break our backbone. You did that so our peak isn't able to make it through this hard time. Bai Jian-song roared. Blood spilled out from the corner of his mouth. The people of Hidden Star Peak had never bothered to hide their shortcomings from the others. The senior elder of the Clear Sky pair didn't care about Bai Jian-song's clamoring. He took it as a funny joke. The Hidden Star Peak was undoubtedly a latent power. However, Clear Sky Peak wasn't a simple power either. And, it certainly wasn't like the War Dead Star Peak, whose chief had been chased around like a dog by Huang Wuji. Clear Sky Peak was one of the top 10 inheritances. And, the War Dead Star Peak hadn't even entered among the top 100 inheritances. There was an unimaginable difference between the two forces. The Hidden Star Peak had maintained a low profile. So much so that many people were unaware of the Hidden Star Peak's true power. Everyone drew out their conclusion on the basis of the battle that had just taken place. How strong was Bai Jian-song? He had stepped into the Great Sage Real at such a young age. He would have boundless prospects in the future. However, he still wasn't an opponent for a senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. His cultivation was too short and lacking in comparison. Perhaps, this weakness wouldn't have been this obvious if he had fought against an opponent from the younger generation. However, it had gotten exposed in its entirety while facing a tyrannical expert of the older generation. Presumptuous, the Clear Sky Peak's senior elder coldly scolded. Who are you to raise your voice against a high-level decision? Damn it. You old bastard. You will pay if something happens to my sixth brother. Bai Jian Song exclaimed. Meanwhile, it seemed as if Yishuan and the second god hadn't even noticed these two terrifying experts. They just continued to fight. It should be mentioned that the second god had become relaxed after he saw that the elder of the Clear Sky Peak had gained an upper hand. In fact, he had become even more impatient to kill Yishuan. And, Yishuan had started to resist the second god's attacks even more wholeheartedly. The two of them were too busy to worry about others. They continued to fight. The second god launched an attack. It seemed as if the world itself had lost its color, as if the sky would come crashing down to the ground. The vigorous power of the lance exploded, and rushed straight towards Yishuan to kill him. The second god hadn't used any unnecessary skills. He had merely used pure energy in this attack. Yi Zaiwen's long sword danced in his hand. The sword intention overflowed in the surroundings. Yi Zaiwen's previous attacks had certainly been repelled. However, Yi Zaiwen's fighting intention hadn't declined one bit. His attack rushed into the sky. The point of the lance emitted a white beam in reply. The battle had turned exceptionally intense. Blood was unceasingly gushing out of Yi Zaiwen's body. But, his wounds had instantly repaired once again. But, some wounds had gradually started to appear on the second god's body. The wounds weren't very deep. However, it was still bad when one considers that he was in his transformed form. Many onlookers exclaimed. Several of them were very impressed to see that Yishuan could actually injure the real Titan body. He had only done minor damage, but it was enough to prove their speculation that Yishuan would go for a major counterattack once the second god's real Titan body subsided. Bang! Both of them ferociously collided once again. Then, they were sent flying in the sky by the collision, though, Yishuan went much farther. Both of them spouted blood. Both of them had arrived in a neither-side win situation once again. Their bodies were covered in all kinds of wounds, and blood continued to ooze out from these wounds. Yishuan had sustained more severe injuries than the second god. However, Yi Zaiwen's wounds got restored in a flash once again. This Yishuan is holding his own in this battle against the real body of a Titan. This is unbelievable. An average person's bones would have shattered into pieces if they had received one such blow. And, the next blow would have crushed them to death. Perhaps, this situation is unfavorable for the Titan guy. As you can see, Yishuan has slowly started to gain the power to fight back. Perhaps, this isn't very good news for that Titan guy. Yishuan may make a sudden comeback as long as he doesn't kill Yishuan in one blow. Yi Zaiwen's recovery may not continue like this for long in my opinion. However, it's also possible that the Titan guy won't be able to keep his real Titan form for long. This Titan guy has always done things his own way. He's arrogant and despotic. He doesn't pay attention to anyone. There are rumors that the Clear Sky Peak has paid a considerable price because the Titan guy stood up and took the oath that he'll forever and ever guard the Clear Sky Peak. That's how he has obtained the Clear Sky Peak's support. Well, anyone would agree to the fact that it's extremely tough to get rid of Yishuan. Die, the second god roared. His entire body got covered with cyan-colored energy waves as he swept forward. The entire world trembled. It seemed as if an ancient Titan god had been resurrected. He went all out in an effort to kill Yishuan. Yishuan didn't hold back either. His body was his best defense. So, he continued to fight. This was a battle of life or death, an incredible mortal combat. Both the individuals had gone all out. So, even a small negligence could cost them their life. Both the individuals had put their lives on stake. Other people felt their hair stand on end. This mortal combat had left them in utter shock. Especially Yishuan, since he had managed to keep up with the Titan guy till now. After all, his cultivation level was far inferior to the second god's. The second god growled. Yi Shiwen had been gradually returning to the earlier situation, where he had the upper hand. The second god knew that Yi Shiwen hadn't become stronger. Rather, he himself had become weaker. The suddenly outburst of power that was required for kickstarting and maintaining the transformation had left him weaker than before. Therefore, his transformation had started to fade. His eyes flashed as he stimulated his blood to unleash all sorts of Titan arts, and all of them were aimed at Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen merely brandished his sword to tackle to the incoming attacks. No matter what kind of Titan powers you throw at me, my one sword move can destroy 10,000 principles. Yi Ziwen's long sword vigorously began to gather energy, and suddenly launched an enormous attack. Both of these individuals were walking on the same route, the so-called route to the Great Tao, and they must arrive there easily. The easier it will be, the closer one would get to the Great Tao, and the more terrifying one would become. These two had mutually chosen the easier path of attempting to kill one another. Therefore, only one would come out victorious. This path was easier, that's all. From the second god slowly occupying an absolute upper hand, to Yi Shiwen regaining his position in the battle, this battle had reached its most tragic phase. Both of these individuals had caused severe wounds on the body of the opposite party, and these wounds were difficult to heal. The blood was gushing out of those wounds. They had thoroughly beaten each other's bodies. Their bodies were completely covered in blood as a result. Rumble, they collided again, and a figure went flying upside down. Everyone looked closely. It was the second god. On watching carefully, one could see that the second god's real Titan body had disappeared. There was no difference between him and an average person at this moment. Blood was dripping from his body. He had fallen into the disadvantageous position in this clash of absolute power. Yi Ziwen's sword slashed several times. Each of his slashes cut through the Tao principles of the world. It seemed as if the era of primal chaos had been restarted. The sword slashes rushed towards the second god, one by one. It seemed as if they were pursuing his soul. This was Yi Ziwen's turn to counterattack. It seemed as if the heaven and the earth, the sun and the moon, had started to revolve around Yi Ziwen's long sword. Those who wouldn't obey would be cut apart. Yi Shiwen pushed the second god into the disadvantageous position. Everyone was dumbstruck by this. Many people had already guessed this move, but they were still extremely shocked to witness it happen in reality. Puchi! Yi Ziwen's long sword emitted an incredible divine beam. It chopped off second god's left arm. This fight had entered the deciding stage of life or death very quickly. The second god screamed. His entire body was covered with bloodstains. Even his courage had been cut off by Yi Shiwen. Some bitter resentment was left in his eyes, but he no longer had that same imposing aura he previously did. He still possessed the invincible strength, but no longer had the invincible heart. Everyone had gone silent. Nobody had thought that this could be the outcome. There would have been no problems if the second god had been merely killed. However, he had been first brought to the point of being terrified before getting killed. He would now be scared until he had died. After all, he had even used his biggest hidden trump card. Still, he had miserably failed to beat Yi Shiwen. How could he not be terrified after that? I'm invincible. You're merely relying on your secret technique and nothing more. Otherwise, I would have killed you effortlessly, the second god said, and it seemed like he hadn't yet resigned. Humph. I'm relying on secret technique? You have a Titan body. Isn't that unfair? You would have been nothing more than a pig in my eyes if you didn't have that Titan body. You're very stupid. Yi Shiwen coldly retorted. Chapter 401. Yi Shiwen wasn't angered by the second god's remark. Rather, he found it laughable. The second god was too naive in making such a ridiculous claim that Yi Shiwen had relied on a secret technique. He himself had relied on his Titan body to spread his tyranny. However, he hadn't thought that he wouldn't have been ranked as a Heaven's Pride level expert if he didn't have the Titan body. He had consistently flown with the wind, and had ended up becoming accustomed to it. It was normal if he won. However, if someone else won, it meant that they had drawn support from some secret technique. According to him, his Titan body must be treated as an ordinary fighting power, while the other secret techniques were external powers. This was a very immature and laughable way of thinking. The second god had never come across any setbacks or defeat in the past. And, Yishuan had emerged from the bottom, and had made his way to the top by killing everyone who stood in his way. There was nothing to compare between these two individuals. Yishuan had never thought about how outstanding his innate talent was, or how noble his bloodline was. He merely wanted to get stronger than the others, and he had struggled for the same purpose. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that every single step that he had taken had left bloody footprints behind. A short-time defeat couldn't sway his firm mindset. So what if the opponent was stronger than him? It didn't matter whether his opponent was using his own strength, or some external help. He would do anything in his power to kill his enemy. He would hone his own strength and get stronger if he didn't have enough strength. He would strive to surpass his opponent, no matter what. And then, he would defeat them. This was precisely because he had never placed himself above everyone else. He knew that there must be others who were probably stronger than him. He also didn't consider his innate talent to be at the peak. Therefore, a temporary setback was unlikely to sway his confidence. However, the second god was different. He had always had a smooth sailing. His Titan body had given him invincible confidence. Even the other Heaven's Pride-level experts were afraid of the consequences. However, he had never thought of the possibility of losing. Today, his biggest moral support had been smashed by Yishuan. One could only imagine the kind of mental state he was in. Humph. I'm relying on secret technique? You have a Titan body. Isn't that unfair? You would have been nothing more than a pig in my eyes if you didn't have that Titan body. You're very stupid. Yishuan coldly retorted. Bang! Yishuan slapped the second god, and he went flying in the sky. He spouted blood from his mouth. His robust body had gone flying upside down. Fortunately, the Titan body was incomparably strong. This slap would have smashed another person's body into pieces. However, even then, his flesh had cracked open. His red blood, which was mixed with cyan-colored divine blood, gushed out like a shower. Everyone was dumbstruck. A pin-drop silence spread. Everyone was in utter shock after they witnessed this. This scene was extremely horrifying. Those who saw this scene were extremely terrified. They had speculated how this mortal combat would turn out to be, and how one person would win the battle by a narrow margin. However, it turned out to be very different from what they had anticipated. There had always been a big gap between the two fighters. The Titan guy had initially suppressed Yishuan with the help of his Titan body. And then, Yishuan had fought back and suppressed him. Then again, he had unleashed the real Titan body, and had suppressed Yishuan completely. Thereafter, Yishuan made a comeback in the end. However, he had now come across Yishuan's cruel suppression. The Titan guy had gained fame several years ago. He had enjoyed the reputation of a top-notch expert of the younger generation in his early days on this ancient road. In fact, he had attracted the attention of the experts of the true martial university before he had even stepped on this ancient road. He hadn't joined the true martial university willingly, as if to boast his own importance. Rather, he had stepped on this ancient road. Even so, he had managed to gain an outstanding reputation. He had caught the attention of several experts of the true martial university from that time itself. However, nobody knew where Yishuan was at that time. Yishuan used to be one of the outstanding new talents who had risen abruptly at that time. But, he was far from being comparable to the second god. They didn't belong to the same level. However, nobody had thought that the second god would be suppressed by Yishuan. They had never anticipated that a man who had already stepped into the semi-sage realm would be suppressed by one who hadn't even entered the semi-sage realm. This outcome would have been normal if they were at the same realm. After all, Even a small disparity between the contending experts could create a huge difference in the fight's outcome. Therefore, determining the winner in a single move wasn't something strange either. However, it turned out that Yi Xuan hadn't even entered the half-step Legendary's great complete realm, let alone the semi-sage realm. Even so, he had completely suppressed the second god. The second god had been beaten miserably. In fact, he was nearly half dead. One of his arms had been cut off, and he had been sent flying into the sky by a slap. Impossible. I'm invincible. You're nothing compared to me, the second god roared. His black hair swirled in the wind. His mind was in chaos. He believed that he was invincible. However, the facts showed otherwise. He had suffered defeat at the hands of Yi Xuan. Moreover, it wasn't an ordinary defeat, but a crushing one. He had basically been suppressed by Yi Xuan very thoroughly. So, how could he possibly be invincible after that? How did this happen? The second god appeared like a madman at this moment. He shot a punch across the sky. The endless thunder and lightning mixed with a cyan-colored storm, and rushed towards Yi Xuan. He straightaway abandoned the lance, and used the remarkable Titan powers. Titan race had once shaken the entire world and the heavenly clans with their inherent powers. The second god's move exploded the world, and it seemed as if the world had lost its color. An ancient aura swept out. It seemed as if this aura had crossed the river of time to arrive from the past. Yi Xuan exposed a cold smile. His golden divinity started to surge and boil. He used the move Hidden Dragon Rises from the Abyss. His hands transformed into a pair of dragon claws, and welcomed the incoming attack. Rumble, the second god was struck by Yi Xuan again, and was sent flying into the sky. His arm was shattered by the terrifying power. This was the first time he had fallen behind in a clash of pure strength. His arm had been crushed by Yi Xuan. This outcome would have been unimaginable during the early phase of their battle. However, it seemed pretty normal at this time. Nobody felt anything wrong with it. Everyone knew that Yi Xuan had gained an upper hand. The second god had been trapped in confusion. It wasn't like he didn't have the power to fight on equal terms. However, he was no longer Yi Xuan's opponent now. That was because Yi Xuan had seized his willpower, and had eliminated his fighting intention. It's impossible. Blood was unceasingly gushing out from the corners of the second god's mouth. It was very hard to believe. What Titan body? Your ancestors were Titans, but do you know how formidable they were in reality? Those formidable and glorious Titans disappeared long ago. Moreover, you only possess Titan's blood, nothing more. Yet, you proudly rely on your Titan power. In fact, you dare to boast about it. Don't you think it's rather laughable? Only an invincible heart can lead you on the road to invincibility. Anything else is insufficient to depend on. Yi Xuan spoke. Do you think that I'm fortunate to have this secret technique that has made me victorious? I've arrived here by walking step by step. I didn't have a smooth sail like you did. I had to kill many powerful enemies. In fact, I barely managed to save my life many times. Only then have I managed to create this disparity in our strengths. It's not by a fluke. It's not luck. The second god's eyes turned somewhat dull after he had listened to Yi Xuan's words. His vision wasn't conceited as before. It seemed as if he had realized that his perception wasn't the reality. He had finally come out of his illusion. He unceasingly groaned in a low voice. He had never imagined that he could lose in this manner. Actually, not lose, but outdone. He had always underestimated the bloodline of ordinary people. Yet, his noble bloodline lost today, and, so had his pride. He had been certain of his victory in his heart, because he possessed the Titan bloodline. However, his bloodline had lost. And so, his ego had disappeared. I had forgotten about your army of God, and what had happened between us. I didn't expect that you would come forth so impatiently. You've courted your death by doing so. Nobody can save you now. Yi Zaiwen's countenance turned grim as he spoke. Yi Shiwen didn't wish to show any mercy. He and the second god had tried to kill each other countless times during the course of the battle. Only the death of one of these two could end this battle. Therefore, he was unlikely to show any mercy. Clang! Yi Zaiwen's long sword soared in the sky. It streaked across the vast sky in a split second, and rushed towards the second god to split him apart. Is this the end? Will it end like this? This mortal combat will end with the defeat and death of the second god? Bang! A terrifying collision sound resounded. Yi Zaiwen's long sword had crashed into a big hand. That big hand was made up of energy, and it had grabbed Yi Zaiwen's long sword. Yi Zaiwen's complexion suddenly changed. Someone had dared to interfere in this battle of life or death. He looked upward. It was the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. Old man, what is the meaning of this? Yi Shiwen asked in a cold voice. There was no trace of respect in his words. This old man had left a very bad impression on him from the beginning. He had dared to provoke the hidden star peak without any hesitation in order to support the second god. He had also injured the third brother. The elder merely turned towards the second god and shouted, "You idiot! You should be happy that this only the outcome of a battle, nothing more. It's nothing. You have long way ahead. Your road is still quite long. Sage Realm? Even the Great Sage Realm won't be the peak of your achievements. A temporary setback like this one is nothing. You will get the opportunity to bathe in the snow sooner or later. You can clear your reputation then." The second god's eyes gradually began to regain their vigor after he heard the senior elder's shout. He realized that this was merely a fight, nothing more. It was no big deal. He still had a future ahead of him. He could always get a chance to bathe in the snow and wash away his shame. He had always been an outstanding and shrewd talent. He had been terrified by Yi Shiwen for a short period of time. But, the great confusion in his heart had vanished within a moment. His defeated state of mind had also vanished, in fact, it had regained its previous form by now. The elder seemed satisfied as he watched the second gods recover. He nodded with satisfaction. He had some regrets that Yi Shiwen wasn't dead. However, it didn't mean that the second god hadn't harvested anything from this battle. He was sure that Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to escape next time. Yi Shiwen felt very regretful as he watched the second god regain his state of mind. He had scared the second god and seized his willpower with great difficulty. But, the second god turned out to be fortunate since someone interfered. Yi Shiwen recalled this old man had previously said that the higher authorities had agreed to this mortal combat, and that no one was allowed to interfere. Yet, he himself had interfered. This was pure shamelessness. What was more annoying was the fact that the elder was still instigating the second god to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen in the future. You have no sense of shame, you old guy. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth tightly as he stated. Give it a rest. The battle has ended. It's hereby terminated, the senior elder flatly stated as if he was merely notifying everyone about the matter. Chapter 402. Didn't your elders teach you how to respect an elder? Anyone can commit mistakes. One must forgive them when possible. That elder from the Clear Sky Peak spoke with a strong sense of righteousness. He didn't seem to feel any shame in his heart. Yi Shiwen was like an ant in his eyes. Yi Shiwen might have boundless future prospects. However, that was a matter for the future. He didn't care about it. He had the backing of the Clear Sky Peak, and it was one of the top 10 inheritances. Yi Shiwen wouldn't be a big threat for a top 10 inheritance even if he were to grow stronger in the future, even if he were to become a top-notch senior great sage expert. This was one of the main reasons why this elder had allowed the second god to kill Yi Shiwen despite the protests from the Hidden Star Peak. People don't care about an ant's feelings. They merely trample ants to death. Yi Shiwen must shed tears of thankfulness for not being stamped to death. That was the elder's way of thinking. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth and spoke, respect an elder. It depends on whether you deserve it or not. Do you even behave like an elder? Moreover, you said that anyone can make mistakes. So, one must forgive them when possible. But, he came here to kill me. How can you possibly call it a forgivable mistake? Anyone can commit mistakes. One must forgive then when possible. This was a great-sounding and pompous saying, but it had vanished long ago. This was a typical case of using double standards, one set of rules for other people, and a completely different set of rules when it comes to oneself. You're just a corrupt old fogey who likes to cheat by using double standards. Yi Shiwen sneered and retorted impolitely. Do you wish to die? It's true that you're a peerless genius who has boundless future prospects. However, you're not even a semi-sage expert at present, the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak threatened him. His complexion turned somewhat unsightly. Yi Shiwen was like an ant in his eyes. And, he had dared to say such insulting words to him. This was an enormous provocation. It's genuinely laughable. Others mustn't interfere since the higher authorities have given their consent to this fight. These were your words. However, the man who shamelessly intervened at the end was you. Is your Clear Sky Peak filled with people like you? Yi Shiwen sneered and retorted. The killing intention flourished in Yi Zaiwen's heart. This senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak had a bias in the second god's favor. This inspired his killing intention, and the anger flourished multiplicatively. This was very pathetic. Firstly, they advocated this fight to death, and now they were against it. Everyone stared blankly at Yi Shiwen. He had held an extremely stubborn image in everyone's eyes since the beginning. He had even killed the law enforcement hall's disciples after having announced it beforehand. However, they hadn't anticipated him to be this arrogant. He was looking down on a senior elder of the Great Sage Realm. He had even talked back maliciously, and had insulted the senior elder in the process. This elder of the Great Sage Realm wasn't a generous person by nature. However, Yi Shiwen had still dared to be so courageous before him. This inspired a sense of reverence in people's hearts for Yi Shiwen. Well said. Clear Sky Peak is like this only. Bai Jian sneered as he came over to Yi Zaiwen's side. He seemed in a somewhat distressed state. However, nothing could conceal his rebellious nature. I'll stop this old guy. You go and kill that guy. I'll see who dares to stop you. Damn it, didn't he say that the higher authorizes have given their consent? Bai Jian sneered. The anger in his eyes could burn the blue dome of sky. He certainly knew the intention of that Clear Sky Peak's senior elder. The higher authorities had agreed to Yi Zaiwen's slaughter by the second god's hands. And, it was also clear who had made them do so. However, they couldn't say it openly. So, it seemed like they had only agreed for the two individuals to settle their personal grudges. However, they hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would gain an upper hand in this battle instead of the second god. Bai Jian was suddenly aggrieved in his mind. He didn't know what price the people of the Clear Sky Peak had paid. However, this matter hadn't ended yet. It seemed like the people who had approved this matter had only included one individual in their calculation, not the other. Bai Jian, is this what you teach your new disciples? The Titan body is a genius of our true martial university. He can become the backbone of our university in the future. Do you understand? The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak looked coldly at Bai Jian as he spoke. Well, that very individual lost in the battle. Yet, you still dare to boast about him? Ha ha. I'm really out of words here if you're saying that this so-called genius of your Clear Sky Peak is proud that he can suppress an expert of lower realm. Bai Jian mocked in a satirical manner. Everyone secretly exclaimed in admiration. These two brothers were the same. Both of them were courageous, and had looked down on a so-called senior elder. Everyone understood Bai Jian's intention. The sarcastic meaning in Bai Jian's words was clear to everyone. He basically meant that the so-called geniuses of the Clear Sky Peak had no other talents apart from using their realm's advantage to suppress those at lower one. The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak had used the advantage of his cultivation level to suppress Bai Jian Song. And, the second god had also tried to do the same to suppress Yi Shiwen. Therefore, everyone believed that this was indeed true. Perhaps Yi Shiwen and his fellow brother apprentice would have chased down their opponents like stray dogs if they had been in the same realm. The senior elder's complexion had turned ashen. These two brothers had repeatedly mocked him. His complexion had turned exceptionally unsightly as a result of this. Humph. I see. You people of the Hidden Star Peak are courting death, the senior elder threatened. Yi Shiwen rushed ahead. The huge devil wings behind his body had opened up. Yi Shiwen had dashed towards the second god like the flash of a golden lightning. His devil wings were flapping at an incredibly fast speed. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had unleashed the entirety of his strength. He arrived in front of the second god in a split second. Audacious. The senior elder went completely mad. Yi Shiwen had dared to make a move in his presence. This clearly demonstrated that Yi Shiwen had looked down on him. This suddenly sparked immense anger inside him. The senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak launched an attack almost instantly, and a shocking divine beam was sent rumbling towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Ziwen's devil wings flapped behind him, and he dodged that sharp divine beam. Bang! The divine beam ripped open the space and the chaos leaked out. Everyone was terrified by this scene. Old man, you're truly shameless. Bai Jian Song released an astonishing sword beam. You can't recognize what's good for you. The senior elder snorted coldly. He grabbed that sword beam which could have easily cracked open the sky. And then, he crushed it. Afterward, he advanced towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. Ha! A delicate yet loud shout came from the horizon. The clouds began to tremble frantically. A magnificent attack streaked across the vast sky. It appeared like a giant black dragon as it swept down upon the senior elder. Bang! The senior elder couldn't evade this attack. A whip struck him, and his body was nearly split apart. Bang! That old man went flying in the sky. The whip's attack didn't kill him. It just inflicted minor injuries to his body. However, his complexion had turned exceptionally ugly. He looked towards the origination point of that attack with a dull look on his face. A delicate and charming figure slowly appeared from the void. She looked approximately 20 years old. Her skin was glowing like snow. Her eyebrows were curved, and her mouth was small. She looked extremely beautiful. She was clad in a fiery red dress. She held a long whip in her hand. She looked valiant and formidable. Second sister. A smile appeared on Bai Jian Song's face as he saw this woman. He also felt a bit relaxed. Yi Shiwen turned around to see. He had heard a lot about the well-known second sister. But, this was the first time he was seeing her. Lu Yanlan was famous for being a practice maniac. She basically practiced all year round. It was quite difficult to force her out of her practice. Crash bang! Another whip was swept down towards the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak. It sent sonic booms in all directions. It appeared like black lightning as it quickly arrived in front of the senior elder. The senior elder had no other choice but to retreat frantically in order to avoid this whip attack. Everyone was stunned. Some people had recognized her. This was Hidden Star Peak's second disciple. She was named Lu Yanlan. However, she had merely used one whip attack to compel the senior elder to retreat. This kind of strength was too incredible. No wonder the Hidden Star Peak was so strong. Huang Wuji was invincible. This second disciple Lu Yanlan wasn't easy to deal with either. Plus, Bai Jian Song had already stepped into the Great Sage Realm. And, Yi Shiwen also had the potential to enter the Great Sage Realm if he didn't perish in the way. The true strength of the Hidden Star Peak had instilled a new level of reverence inside everyone's heart. The Hidden Star Peak was small, yet proficient. It didn't have many people. However, they were elites, all of them. Lu Yanlan merely stood at her spot. Her aura was as tyrannical as an endless ocean. Her energy could swallow thousands of miles. She appeared like a goddess. Her temperament was ice-cold and unapproachable. Yi Xuan shot a glance at her, and rushed towards the second god to kill him. He didn't even stop once. The second god saw Yi Xuan approach him. He was startled. But, he became furious as well. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Xuan would dare to launch an attack on him despite the opposition from the Clear Sky Peak's senior elder. Moreover, Yi Xuan looked desperate to kill him, and wasn't willing to let him off. Suddenly, his heart began to burn with anger. He had never realized that Yi Xuan would have tried to kill him even if he hadn't insisted on a fight with Yi Xuan. However, the upper echelons of the university would be alerted if Yi Xuan were to kill him now. This obviously left Yi Xuan to feel more threatened by the second god's existence. Things might become very messy in the future if Yi Xuan were to spare the second god. "You wouldn't dare," the second god roared loudly. "Stop," the Clear Sky Peak's elder shouted. He wanted to help the second god. However, Lu Yanlan and Bai Jian couldn't possibly have allowed him succeed in his plan. They joined forces, and launched attacks on him. Bang! The fight between those three great sage experts caused the collapse of the sky. The earth trembled, and the chaos leaked out from the spatial debris. The space got crushed wherever they trod. This great sage-level battle was exceptionally frightening for most spectators. Yi Xuan had rushed towards the second god to kill him without showing any regard for the senior elder's opposition. The second god had recovered a lot since he had taken advantage of the time. However, his healing speed couldn't be compared with Yi Zaiwen's. After all, Yi Xuan had the Phoenix regeneration technique, while he didn't. Time had passed quickly, and he had only managed to recover to some extent. However, he didn't have the means to continue to withstand Yi Zaiwen's attacks. Bang! He wasn't Yi Zaiwen's opponent. Yi Zaiwen's slap sent him flying into the sky. "I'm invincible," the second god shouted in a somewhat demented manner. Yi Xuan sneered. Yi Xuan trod on a golden light, and arrived in front of the second god. Then, he launched a grindstone-like slap at him. "Stop," the Clear Sky Peak's elder roared. However, Yi Xuan paid no attention to it, and slapped the second god a second time. Bang! The second god's body was disintegrated by Yi Zaiwen's slap. Chapter 403. The Titan body was dead. The news exploded and spread throughout the True Martial University. It shook the entire True Martial University. This was the first time a Heaven's Pride level expert of the younger generation had died in a battle. However, this wasn't the thing that had shocked people the most. After all, the second god was the one who had issued the declaration for battle. Moreover, he had obtained the approval of the higher authorities. He had been able to issue a death match against Yi Xuan as a result of this approval. Therefore, everyone knew that the battle between these two individuals wasn't going to end on a good note. In fact, one among them had to die. However, they had never thought that the person to die at the end would be the second god. Everyone had thought that it would be Yi Xuan. After all, Yi Zaiwen's strength was much lower than the second god since they latter had already entered the semi-sage realm. One must know that their realms differed by heaven and earth since Yi Xuan hadn't even entered the half-step Legendary's great complete realm. Everyone below the sage realm was like an ant. The semi-sage realm obviously wasn't the same as the sage realm. However, it still had the word sage attached to it. So, it was bound to give immense strength. The legendary realm couldn't be compared with it. Therefore, everyone was optimistic that the second god would kill Yi Xuan with ease. They had expected that he would thoroughly defeat Yi Xuan at the very least. After all, Yi Zaiwen's realm differed by a significant margin. However, they hadn't anticipated that the person who would die in the end would turn out to be the second god. Moreover, Yi Xuan hadn't used any cheap tricks to pull this off. He had depended on his tyrannical strength to suppress and then kill the second god. And, that too after terrifying him. This had even scared the onlookers. They hadn't anticipated this outcome. The second god had nearly been driven to the point of insanity before death. Even the interference of a great sage expert hadn't been able to prevent his death. Yi Xuan hadn't cared about facing the frightening coercion of a great sage expert. Word spread that Yi Xuan had killed the second god. It caused a huge uproar. Countless people were discussing about this matter. They were discussing the possible consequences of this matter. The Clear Sky Peak was one of the top 10 inheritances. It certainly wouldn't shy away from expressing its wrath. The Hidden Star Peak wasn't a pushover either. It had already caused havoc throughout the War Dead Star Peak for Yi Xuan. They weren't easy to deal with. That startling collision between the three great sage experts had transcended everyone's imagination. It had been a disastrous battle. A high-level expert was forced to arrive in order to prevent the two sides from killing each other. It didn't matter how the higher authorities would look into this matter. Yi Xuan had suddenly become popular. Many people had started to remember him. People had initially believed that Yi Xuan was at the bottom amongst the Heaven's Pride level experts. However, it didn't look like that now. Yi Zaiwen's fighting strength was perhaps sufficient to rank him amongst the top ones. He had become famous overnight. And, that too in a world where many people were ambitious to compete on this road to invincibility. His peers felt a bit depressed. Yi Xuan was powerful, and he wasn't even at the so-called 200th rank. Yet, he had established a scary reputation for himself. This frightened everyone even more. Everyone had seen that Yi Xuan succeeded in defeating his opponent by depending on his true strength alone. However, such ability seemed exceptionally dreadful. The Clear Sky Peak had no choice but to suffer in silence. This was the first time they had been forced into such a situation. After all, they were the ones who had advocated this battle. They had paid a considerably high price in order to get the approval of the higher authorities. However, what about the outcome? The second god had gotten killed by Yi Xuan in the end. They had been taken aback by this result. Nobody had anticipated such an outcome. They needed to have a reason to make noise. The Clear Sky Peak had wanted to impose itself onto the Hidden Star Peak, but couldn't say something like let Yi Xuan die to compensate second god's death. They couldn't say it out aloud even if they wanted this to happen. They had no option but to accept this outcome. Nobody would know if something were to happen in private. However, they would have to appear peaceful from the outside, at the very least. Yi Zaiwen's name had thoroughly spread in the true martial university. It was reported that even the supreme officials had heard this name. Killing the second god had also brought piles of trouble for him. For example, he had suddenly become famous. He had been named a Heaven's Pride level expert before this battle. However, he hadn't been regarded on top thus far. That was because everyone considered him as the weakest amongst all the Heaven's Pride level experts. However, this notion had suddenly changed. The Titan guy was considered at the top of Heaven's Pride level experts. This was so because none of these Heaven's Pride level experts had ever indulged in a mutual conflict. The battle between Yi Xuan and the second god was the very first collision between two Heaven's Pride level experts. Therefore, nobody could say who among these Heaven's Pride level experts was stronger, and who was weaker. However, the existing fact was that Yi Xuan had killed the second god. So, he had suddenly become the target of public attention. He had also obtained the top position among the Heaven's Pride level experts on temporary basis. He used to have a low-key profile, and had stayed hidden on the side. However, he had suddenly become the center of everyone's attention at present. Of course, there were several disadvantages related to this. Yet, it also had advantages. One of the advantages was that he had obtained the attention of higher authorities. Yi Xuan had come to be known as a Heaven's Pride level expert in the past. However, very few people regarded him as a genuine one. He hadn't been acknowledged by the higher authorities. After all, Yi Zaiwen's cultivation had been lower than the minimum requirement of half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm at the time. So, it was quite difficult to tell whether he had boundless future prospects or not. After all, he didn't seem much different from most of the ordinary people. The true martial university had been standing tall and upright in the southern region since countless years. They had even ruled the entire true martial world once upon a time. So, they wouldn't look at the short-lived fads. Rather, their gaze was fixed at the matters of the future, several hundred, or even several thousand years from now. Therefore, it was quite difficult for a short-lived tyranny to attract their attention. Only the people who had at least practiced till half-step legendary 9th stage could obtain their acknowledgement. And even so, the experts of half-step legendary 9th stage were merely considered elites. Only the experts of half-step legendary's great complete realm could be called as real heaven's pride level experts. One's present tyranny didn't ensure that they would remain as such in the future. They must be able to become the true martial university's backbone in the future, after 1,000 or several thousand years. This incident of agreeing to this death match had been largely related to this notion. Yi Xuan hadn't made them feel that he was unexpendable. However, the situation had reversed after this incident. Yi Xuan had obtained everyone's acknowledgement in its entirety. Therefore, the true martial university rewarded Yi Xuan with a 100,000 primary spirit dawn after he had killed the second god. They gave him other rare herbs etc. as well. Yi Xuan felt that he had genuinely obtained the true martial university's attention, not just materialistic rewards. Bai Jian Song had mentioned that this matter had alarmed one very senior person. This senior person had opened his mouth and spoken, "You've made enough noise. Now go back, and reflect on your mistakes in seclusion." The Clear Sky Peak had initially wanted to cause trouble. However, they had no other choice but to abandon their idea of causing trouble after looking at the power and influence of this senior person. The Clear Sky Peak certainly had the wrong stance in this matter. But, that senior person seemed in a mood to punish the innocent and guilty alike. However, Yi Xuan was rather pleased when he heard this news. This was indicative that the higher authorities wouldn't support the opposite party. Yi Xuan had never hoped that the higher authorities would support him. However, this meant that they wouldn't cause any more trouble for him. This was the advantage of displaying strength. There were pros as well as cons to this. And, to choose one of the two was beyond Yi Zaiwen's control. Yi Xuan was grounded for a year as a punishment for killing the second god. The higher authorities had issued the punishment. However, everyone felt that this judgment was extremely biased in favor of Yi Xuan. The price for murder was death penalty. However, Yi Xuan was only grounded for a year. This indeed seemed like a biased decision in Yi Zaiwen's favor to outsiders. However, both the sides involved in this matter were very much dissatisfied. The Clear Sky Peak felt that this punishment was too light as per Yi Zaiwen's conduct. However, the Hidden Star Peak felt otherwise. Yi Xuan had killed the second god. But, their side hadn't instigated this matter. Everyone had agreed upon this death match. In fact, many high-level officials had even witnessed the battle. Killing one's opponent in a death match shouldn't lead to a punishment of being grounded for a year. This didn't make sense. Had this been done to bully the handful members of the Hidden Star Peak? However, Yi Xuan himself didn't complain. He could tell that the higher authorities were divided into two factions over this matter. He could tell that both the factions had arrived at a mutual compromise to conclude this matter. He didn't see any loss in this matter. There was no harm for him in being grounded for a year. In fact, he could seize this opportunity to consolidate this half-step legendary 9th stage realm. One could only imagine how difficult it would have been to condense principles in this realm. Yi Xuan must spend time to consolidate these newly acquired things. And, this was the best chance. The only problem was that he had planned to go to the chaotic heavenly territory. This trip could only be put down for now. Time passed quickly. It didn't stop for anyone. It passed day by day. The effects of the sensation caused by Yi Xuan also faded away with time. Several people would arrive every day at the Hidden Star Peak after Yi Xuan had been grounded for a year. They'd hoped to see Yi Xuan, who was undergoing closed-door training at the steep cliff of the Hidden Star Peak. They would often come to take a look at this temporary top heavens pride level expert of the younger generation. However, this sensation slowly quieted down like any other matter along with the passage of time, day by day, month by month. It had slowly disappeared from people's discussions too. No new news disseminated during the 1 year's time that Yishuan spent grounded. It was indeed a short-lived fad. So, people forgot this person named Yishuan. Yishuan was happy being idle since he could practice properly. He could comprehend the Tao principles without being disturbed by the others. There is a gap of one entire realm between Yishuan and second god. Realm versus stage. Think of realm as an accomplishment in martial arts. But, there are usually several stages that one must cross in order to attain one accomplishment. And, one attains new powers and expertise with each new accomplishment. Sometimes, these changes are qualitative. For example, if a semi-sage expert releases a certain amount of energy, it should be able to beat the same amount of energy released by an expert of lower realm. That's because the semi-sage level energy is qualitatively superior. The same can be said about one's physical strength. However, not many changes on the qualitative side occur with each new stage. Only quantitative changes occur. Chapter 404. 1 year passed, the hidden star peak was still the same as it was 1 year ago. It was still tall and lofty. It still seemed as if it would pierce the sky. It had been nearly restored to normal appearance post the destruction caused by the startling battle that had taken place over a year ago. It had been the same since hundreds of thousands of years, somewhat desolate, but with a boundless presence. Ma Wenrui was an ordinary former disciple of the Heavenly Ocean Peak. This peak was situated in the vicinity of the Hidden Star Peak. He would pass through the Hidden Star Peak every day. He had done so for over 100 years. He had entered the true martial university over 100 years ago. He had traveled like this every day ever since because he wasn't an elite disciple. So, he wasn't qualified enough to reside on the Heavenly Ocean Peak. Therefore, he had to travel to the Heavenly Ocean Peak to attend lectures every day. Afterwards, he would return to the city. He passed through the Hidden Star Peak today as well, just like every other day. It was nothing special. He had been doing this for more than 100 years. However, the peak had turned a bit livelier over the last 2 years. The disciples of this peak had obtained a whole new level of respect in the eyes of the people. Huang Wuji, Yi Shiwen, Lu Yanlan, and Bai Jian were once unknown names. But, the reputation of these individuals had slowly spread in these few years. Their reputation might have brought more trouble to their doorstep. However, provoking them wasn't a good thing. The law enforcement hall had provoked them once. Several of their disciples had been slaughtered as a result. And, one Heaven's Pride level disciple had also died doing the same. This was disastrous loss. The War Dead Star Peak had also dared to provoke them once. Consequently, their chief had been chased around like a stray god. Even the Clear Sky Peak had provoked them once. And, they were amongst the top 10 inheritances. Their Heaven's Pride level expert had been killed in the end. Even the senior elder of the Clear Sky Peak had been put into a distressed situation by the joint attacks of Bai Jian and Lu Yanlan. So, they weren't able to get any benefit in the end either. In fact, they had paid a huge price in order to get the approval of the high-level experts. However, their future chief had ended up getting killed in the end. Yet, they hadn't been able to obtain anything. This series of incidents had made the Hidden Star Peak famous. Many ordinary disciples had gotten unusually envious of them. The Hidden Star Peak was like a huge hornet nest. Poke any one of them, and that might provoke a bunch of people. Something like this naturally wasn't possible in other inheritances. Other inheritances had more than hundreds of thousands of disciples. So, only the super elites enjoyed such privileged treatment. Otherwise, those elders and superiors would have to deal with such matters all day long. Suddenly, Ma Wenrui felt an enormous pressure rise upon his heart. One could clearly see that countless black clouds had assembled in the sky. And they were moving in the hidden star peak's direction. An exceptional heavenly tribulation hovered over the hidden star peak. This attracted the attention of many people. The true Martial University was certain very large. However, it wasn't a big thing for these people with supernatural powers. Any activity in any area could easily attract the attention of several people. Not to mention that this strange event was happening at the hidden star peak. A majority of people had gradually forgotten the hidden star peak after the big event that had taken place a year ago. However, several resolute and interested individuals hadn't forgotten about it. Ma Wenrui was panic-stricken since he realized that this heavenly tribulation was far beyond his imagination. It wasn't an ordinary tribulation that merely rained down thunder and lightning at its target. Rather, this one comprised of a group of lightning soldiers. All of them were clad in metal armors, and held long spears in their hands. They were vigorously rushing towards the hidden star peak to kill their target at this moment. This scene nearly scared him to death. He had seen such heterogeneous heavenly tribulations, but only in ancient books. However, he hadn't seen such a frightening heterogeneous heavenly tribulation in real life. Those soldiers possessed the strength of semi-sage realm. They possessed extremely tyrannical strength. Their bodies were condensed of lightning Tao principles, and magical symbols were floating around them. This spectacle would frighten anyone. The entire hidden star peak had turned into a huge battlefield. Hundreds of lightning soldiers swept down like a rain of lightning and launched attacks. Each one of these attacks was an exceptionally horrifying martial art. A figure was marching back and forth among these lightning soldiers. His hands were like claws. And these claws were emitting golden light of Tao. Each time he attacked with his golden claws, a lightning soldier would get ripped apart. It would then transform into energy, and would get absorbed by him. Yi Zaiwen's complexion was the same as usual. Even this many lightning soldiers couldn't make him anxious. This heavenly tribulation was more terrifying than the previous ones. This was comprised of an army of lightning soldiers. These were more dreadful than those lightning apes or the lightning demon beasts and so on. It was as if the heavens will itself had taken form, and had crusaded against this evildoer since he had surpassed the tolerance and patience of the heavens. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's palm pierced through a lightning soldier. The tyrant body technique was operating throughout his body. That lightning soldier got absorbed by Yi Shiwen. And the transformed lightning went inside Yi Zaiwen's universe. A tremendous change was occurring inside Yi Zaiwen's universe since he was absorbing endless amount of such formidable energy. The quantity of cosmic dust increased more and more. His universe had started to appear more and more like the real one. A new planet began to form inside the solar system by attracting and accumulating countless dusts. The planet finally took shape, and began to revolve on its orbit around the sun. Each of these lightning soldiers was a terrifying expert of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. An expert of the semi-sage realm would be an awful opponent for any other individual. However, they were unworthy in front of Yi Shiwen. It wasn't that these lightning soldiers were weak or anything. Rather, Yi Shiwen was too powerful. He had used this over a year's time to practice. The number of principles within his body had also reached the upper limit of his capacity. He had condensed 299 principles. Of course, the number of new Tao principles that he had condensed in this duration wasn't much. However, these newly condensed principles were 10 times more powerful than the ones he had condensed in the past. That was because the degree of condensation was very solid and deep. This had increased Yi Zaiwen's strength tremendously. In fact, his one causal punch could blast away a dozen experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm at once. Yi Shiwen wasn't even afraid of the experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Moreover, he would be able to condense 200 more Tao principles after he had crossed the heavenly tribulation. Then, he'd be able to beat an ordinary expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Bang! 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 Those lightning soldiers would collaborate from time to time. But they still couldn't sway Yi Shiwen. In fact, he didn't even need to defend himself. He merely used his palm to grab and explode these lightning soldiers. Yi Shiwen had genuinely started to feel the benefits of laying a solid foundation. His foundation was very profound, and his strength was very tyrannical. As a result, he was crossing this tribulation quite easily. He might have succeeded in crossing this tribulation a year ago with the help of his strength. However, he wouldn't have crossed it this easily. Each of these lightning soldiers was only marginally weaker than the last year's Yi Shiwen. Therefore, their sheer number might succeeded in defeating Yi Shiwen a year ago. However, Yi Shiwen could easily wrap them up at present. This was the advantage of laying a robust foundation, and a profound martial power. Yi Shiwen was unaware that several people had gathered to see him cross the tribulation. They were nearly scared to death as they witnessed this. Each of those lightning soldiers appeared like a god to them. Each one of them had iron armors and long spears. It seemed as if these soldiers were on an expedition. However, they couldn't even withstand a few moves that Yi Shiwen casted. They were getting annihilated left and right. They were no match for him. The manner in which Yi Shiwen went about on a killing spree inside that group of lightning soldiers made it seem as if a god had descended into the mortal world. This left countless people to evaluate Yi Shiwen at an even higher level. In fact, nobody said anything regarding Yi Ziwen's title of a Heaven's Pride level expert from the moment he began to cross this tribulation of the Great Complete Realm. Some people had questioned his title in the past. They had said that he hadn't yet reached the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. However, nobody would say that now. This heavenly tribulation was extremely scary. But, it was evident that crossing it wouldn't be difficult for Yi Shiwen judging by the power he was displaying. This also meant that Yi Shiwen would become even more terrifying after he had entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Bang! 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 These lightning soldiers were ferocious and unafraid of death. They rushed forward one by one. Each of them displayed exquisite martial arts. However, they were too weak to compete against Yi Shiwen. They were slaughtered, one after the other. The heavenly tribulation ended. The planet Uranus had been fully condensed inside Yi Ziwen's universe. The solar system had improved by one step. Bang! Yi Ziwen's aura became uncontrollable, and it surged towards the sky. He had finally entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Yi Ziwen's aura got thicker, fuller, and richer. It could be said that the earlier Yi Shiwen was like an unsheathed sword sharp. But, he was now like a sword that was inside the sheath. Not shining, but far more frightening. Yi Ziwen's legendary level power had grown even richer after he entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. It had reached the level of perfection. That's why it was exhibiting such a rich feeling. Yi Shiwen felt a familiar yet strange energy flowing inside his body. It was different from what it had been in the past. It had previously seemed as if a huge barrier was blocking his way. However, this barrier had suddenly vanished. It seemed as if an unseen force had been firmly stopping him from having a breakthrough and condensing 300 Tao principles in his body. But, this unseen power had suddenly vanished. Yi Shiwen promptly sat cross-legged. He began to absorb the power of the surrounding principles, and started to condense them into Tao principles in the form of magical symbols inside his body. The Tao principles appeared like magical symbols as they began to spin inside his body. They gradually condensed and emitted a mysterious aura. 299. 300. 350. 400. The count of Tao principles inside Yi Ziwen's body reached 400, and he started to feel that the accommodation of principles within his body had temporarily reached a saturation point. He would need to temper and refine his body further in order to go past the mark of 500 Tao principles. This amount was required to enter the later half of the semi-sage realm. However, Yi Ziwen's fighting strength was already sufficient to compete with the top experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Yi Shiwen heaved a sigh of relief. He had finally entered the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. His foundation had become very robust. This showed that he didn't possess less potential than those other Heaven's Pride level experts. Yi Xuan was extremely happy about this. The heavenly tribulation had just ended. A pretty figure appeared treading on the rainbow light, and arrived on the hidden star peak. Chapter 405. Yi Xuan has successfully crossed the great complete levels tribulation. His foundation must have reached perfection. His power must have soared up high. Yes. Reaching half-step Legendary's great complete realm is like turning into a dragon from a fish. He's no longer an ordinary person. It's not surprising that Yi Xuan managed to kill that Titan guy. He has crossed an extremely terrifying heavenly tribulation. An average person would have met with an untimely death. However, Yi Xuan treated it like it was nothing. Was that heavenly phoenix body who just passed by? Yes, that's her. I've seen her only once, from afar at that. But, why has she arrived at the hidden star peak? Several people were discussing about today's tribulation. Yi Xuan had once again gained importance in everyone's eyes. Sister Hua. Yi Xuan was surprised for a moment. He didn't expect that the person to arrive would be Hua Menghan. However, he saw a woman clad in black dress. She looked approximately 17 to 18 years old. Her eyebrows were black and curved. She had a tiny mouth and bright eyes. Her fluid glance moved like ripples. Her skin was as white as snow and had a jade-like texture. It was as if a fairy had descended on earth. Her beauty seemed pure and untainted. Wasn't this really Hua Menghan? Yi Xuan saw her treading on the rainbow light. She arrived in front of him in an instant, like a streak of electric flash. He was greatly surprised by this. Hua Menghan had restrained her aura. But, the principles were faintly fluctuating in her aura. She had reached the peak of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. She was surprisingly a bit faster than him in terms of cultivation. Long time no see, Sister Hua. You're still as elegant as before. Your cultivation is somewhat ahead of mine. Yi Xuan couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Hua Menghan's progress had been incredibly fast. He had heard the discussions of the surrounding disciples. He hadn't anticipated that Hua Menghan would turn out to be that heavenly phoenix body. Yi Xuan had recently established his power and glory, but the other Heaven's Pride level experts had carried their own titles for a long time. In fact, people seemed to have forgotten their real names as the time had passed. Yi Xuan had heard the name Heavenly Phoenix Body many times. However, he had never thought that it would be referring to Hua Menghan. However, it wasn't a big deal even if she had the Heavenly Phoenix Body. These Heaven's Pride level experts had magnificent innate talent. In addition, many of them had special physiques. Moreover, their respective inheritances put their entire energy and resources to groom them. They could obtain the guidance of their seniors in case of any difficulty. The hidden star peak was in a bit of a difficult position in this regard. In fact, it was far worse than the other inheritances in this regard. The first disciple Huang Wuji was perennially absent from the peak. The second sister was always undergoing vigorous closed-door training. The third brother, Bai Jian Song, would also disappear occasionally. These three powerhouses were always a complete mess, and were mostly focused on closed-door training. That was because they had to rely on their innate talents because it was hard to have breakthroughs. The other two disciples, namely Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian, were slightly lacking in the aptitude section. They had recently stepped into the later stage of the semi-sage realm with the help of the complete version of the hidden star scripture that Yi Xuan had comprehended. The two of them had deep foundations as they had stepped into Legendary's great complete realm several decades ago. So, they had suddenly obtained successive breakthroughs after they had comprehended the complete version of the hidden star scripture. They had deep foundations. So, they should be able to step into the sage realm before they came to a halt. However, there was no way to consistently get directions from the inheritance or the seniors at this peak. Therefore, the practice conditions of this peak's disciples couldn't be compared with those of the privileged heaven's pride-level experts at the other ones. In fact, an average person would have given up if they were in their place. Thanks to the mysterious space, Yi Shiwen could comprehend all the martial arts techniques. He didn't need the guidance of the teachers, and could well walk on his own. Otherwise, he would have fallen far behind based on the aptitude he had. However, this came with a heavy requirement for Spirit Dawn. Hua Menghan smiled faintly. Her fine black hair was covered with a shawl. She was as elegant as a fairy. Her demeanor had become deeper as her cultivation had become more profound. She was standing in front of him at this moment. However, she could fly up and get anywhere anytime. Where have you been all this time? I heard that you also killed that Titan body. It has caused a huge sensation in the true martial university. Hua Menghan spoke in her mellowed sweet voice. Yi Shiwen smiled bitterly. This matter had gained him a lot of fame. However, he hadn't intended it. He and the Titan guy had been mortal enemies from the beginning. So, there was no way he would have held back. The two of them walked side by side on the lane of the hidden star peak. The setting sun was sketching a beautiful portrait in the background. Their shadows were long cast on a lane that no one had used in a long time. So, it had turned somewhat desolate and bleak. Various kinds of herbs and fruits had overgrown at its edges. And, the ones growing on the lane itself were gently brushing against their hands and leaving faint prints. We are the people of Jianghu. We are bound to go through pain and suffering, Yi Shiwen replied with a smile. Hua Menghan chuckled and spoke, don't talk about pain and suffering. So many people in the true martial university are envious of you now. As if the bird has finally raised its head and revealed itself in the forest. Yi Shiwen indifferently said. Then, he changed the topic, however, one can only reach the top by overcoming the obstacles. I know this is your style. Hua Menghan looked at Yi Shiwen and spoke, I knew long ago that your heart had big desires. Yi Yuan School couldn't entrap you. And, the true martial university won't be able to contain you either. Ha ha ha, you have more confidence in me than I do. Yi Shiwen laughed out loud. They were suddenly at a loss for words, and didn't know what to say. They remained silent for a moment and walked ahead. A long while passed. Yi Shiwen opened his mouth and said, there are many things in this world which don't happen according to one's wishes. And then, we are left with no choices. I wish to walk on this road, and I wish to walk to the top. And, one day the road will end. My fate is under my control, not the heavens. It's very important for you, isn't it? Hua Menghan asked this question out of the blue. Yi Shiwen replied somewhat doubtfully. You have always gone very fast. You never care about the scenery that you leave behind. You just keep going farther and farther away. Hua Menghan said. Yi Shiwen was somewhat speechless. Perhaps, Hua Menghan was right. He had never harbored a sense of belonging to this world. He cared about his close relatives. But, he had never cared about other stuff. In fact, he hardly cared about anything that was the reason why neither Yi Yuan School nor the true martial university would be able to contain him. He genuinely possessed a heart with big desires. It seemed as if he just couldn't find any other thing to be worthy of his attention and care. Yi Shiwen looked at Hua Menghan. He didn't realize that the sun had already set. The moon had quietly climbed up the sky. The somewhat ice-cold moonlight had started to sprinkle on the earth. Hua Menghan looked extraordinarily delicate and beautiful under the moonlight. Her aura also appeared somewhat magical and fairy-like. It was difficult to put his heart's feeling in words. He didn't know what to say. It was a beautiful and charming scene, somewhat like the first time he had met her. I didn't expect that the sister Hua would turn out to be Heavenly Phoenix body with the blood of the ancient Heavenly Phoenix. Yi Shiwen spoke. Yi Mo had told him that the Heavenly Phoenix possessed the noblest blood among all the phoenixes. They were the strongest among all the phoenixes, and were called the King of Phoenixes. Their status could be compared with the 9-clawed golden dragon of the dragon race. However, the heavenly phoenix race had disappeared without a trace long ago. Hua Menghan wanted to say this aloud, but didn't. Rather, she muttered to herself, I would rather not have this bloodline. It's too heavy a burden to shoulder. Too heavy. Then, she abruptly smiled. Her bright smile blossomed like a spring flower, it was devastatingly beautiful. I may never be able to catch up with you if I'm not quicker. Yi Xuan gawked for a second. It seemed as if he was still trying to figure out what she meant by that. Nothing. Forget what I just said. Hua Menghan spoke with a smile, I have come here for a reason. Do you know about the chaotic heavenly territory? Yi Xuan became serious and replied, yes, I know. It's located in the foreign territory. There was a lot of chaos in the chaotic heavenly territory. The people of the true martial world weren't the only ones to visit it. It was home to many escaped criminals from the other regions. It wouldn't be wrong to say that it was very chaotic. In fact, many experts of the Great Sage Realm and above could be found in the depths of the chaotic heavenly territory. They were the self-proclaimed kings of their territories. But, the areas closer to the true martial world were less dangerous since the experts found they weren't too powerful. After all, there were too many experts inside the true martial world. The Great Sage experts were also in abundance. So, the unaffiliated experts and criminals of Great Sage Realm didn't dare to come in the vicinity of the true martial world. I have recently come out from my closed-door training. I'm planning to proceed towards the chaotic heavenly territory for practice. So, would you like to go together? Hua Menghan asked. The others have already entered the chaotic heavenly territory. Yi Xuan knew that Hua Menghan meant the other Heaven's Pride level experts. Well, why not? My punishment sentence will end in a few days. Then, we can go together. Yi Xuan had been planning to go to the chaotic heavenly territory. It was a coincidence that Hua Menghan also wanted to go. Now, they could go together as companions. Several days passed in the blink of an eye. Yi Zaiwen's punishment also ended. Nobody had put surveillance on him. However, Yi Xuan didn't wish to challenge the dignity of the university either. The house arrest ended very quietly. Yi Xuan had already flown away into the endless void along with Hua Menghan by the time some people remembered that it was time for his punishment to end. There was endless void outside the true martial world on the way to the chaotic heavenly territory. They had to fly past millions of feet thick atmosphere. They had to make their way through the thunder and lightning. There were different kinds of extremely frightening astral winds in the way as well. These winds could easily blast a truth-level expert to death. They could even blow away the experts of legendary realm and cause serious injuries to them. It was indeed a very dangerous place. However, both of them were top experts. Hua Menghan had reached the peak of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. And, Yi Zaiwen's gilded tyrant form was very tyrannical. Hua Menghan was wrapped in a layer of silver-white flame. The astral winds that struck her body would get burnt into fragments by this flame. Yi Zaiwen's gilded tyrant form was discharging golden rays of light. He merely allowed the astral winds to caress his body. He wouldn't get swayed at all. Even so, the two of them had to face difficulties as they moved ahead. They flew non-stop for 2 days, and covered several hundred kilometers. The thick atmosphere of the true martial world is extremely terrifying. The Earth's atmosphere doesn't even come close. Yi Xuan heaved a sigh and muttered to himself. They had faced many difficulties during their flight. The true martial world's atmosphere was much higher and thicker than that of the Earth's. It was extremely dangerous as well. Only sage experts could freely travel through it. It was very difficult for the semi-sage experts to pass through it. And, the ordinary legendary experts would get blown away and sustain serious injuries. Yi Xuan had arrived in the foreign territory once before, but he had used the transportation portal. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to pass through this atmosphere since he only had the strength of legendary realm back then. Chapter 406. One would see a grandiose sky if they'd look down from the endless void above. The sky appeared endless, and stretched as far as one's gaze could reach. This area was known as the chaotic heavenly territory. The chaotic heavenly territory was extremely big. It wasn't just some small territory. It was even bigger than the true martial world. It was easier to lose one's way in this boundless star ocean than in the sea. One must know that getting deviated from the intended direction in a huge sea might not turn out to be fatal. However, one might get separated from their destination by thousands of miles if one would deviate from their route in this endless void. Then, they wouldn't be able to find their destination. Therefore, one must have the star map for directional guidance. Hua Menghan possessed one such star map. It wasn't difficult for an expert of her caliber to obtain one. Her current level wasn't very high. So, she could only access the layers of this territory that were in the vicinity of the true martial world using the star map she possessed. However, it was possible to use these star maps to access the depths as well. Therefore, these star maps were considered as treasures in the true martial world. These star maps were also considered as important strategic resources. Just like the other forces, the true martial university had also maintained fixed levels to access the depths of the chaotic heavenly territory for treasure hunting and so on. The possession of a more accurate star map would obviously ensure one's safety to a greater extent. The safety and security of the experts was very important. So, different people could access different layers. This would be in accordance with their levels. The true martial university had once ruled the entire true martial world. The true martial university had sent out their entire manpower to explore the chaotic heavenly territory for resources at that time. Consequently, the true martial university had obtained the most accurate star map. Many other forces had been eyeing this star map. And, they had repeatedly tried to get their hands on one. However, the most accurate star map was in the hands of the supreme authority of the true martial university. Other people only possessed the star maps of different precision and layers as per their ranks. However, even a primary level star map was enough for Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. They didn't intend to go into the depths of chaotic heavenly territory in any case. Venturing to the depths at their current levels was no different than throwing one's own life away. However, Yi Shiwen soon realized that this starry region was nothing like what he had imagined. It wasn't even remotely a silent and quiet place. On the contrary, one could get slaughtered at anywhere. Be careful. We would be going straight into a region controlled by star beasts if this map is correct. Hua Menghan warned. A large number of star beasts were stationed in this starry void. These star beasts were extremely strange. They could somehow survive without air. Going into this region was extremely dangerous. Several star beasts emerged out of nowhere and surrounded them as soon as Hua Menghan's voice faded. These star beasts were even more tyrannical than the ones Yi Shiwen had encountered in the foreign battlefield. Each of these star beasts was pitch black. Their entire body was covered with scales. These fish-type star beasts had ominous fangs, and each of them looked extremely powerful. They nearly possessed the strength of legendary 8th or 9th stage. Their leader was at semi-sage realm. It was exceptionally powerful. Puff! 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 Each of these fanged star beasts spat water spears in unison. These attacks were centered at Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. Yi Shiwen didn't get enough time to attack, but Hua Menghan had already launched one. A flaming lotus appeared in her hand. It then expanded to face the attacks. Bang! A huge explosion occurred. The flaming lotus exploded among those strange fish-like star beasts. The terrifying temperature of the explosion destroyed those strange fish-like beasts. They couldn't even approach those two. The chief fish-like star beast was at the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. It was wounded by the flaming lotus explosion. So, It roared as it opened its big mouth, and ferociously rushed towards Yi Shiwen to bite him. Its big mouth nipped at Yi Shiwen, and the void was broken into pieces. It was an extremely terrifying scene. Yi Shiwen dodged and rushed up. He sneered. His big hand stretched out towards that chief strange fish-like beast to grab it. This strange head fish was extremely tyrannical. So much so that it could bite an ordinary expert of initial stage of the semi-sage realm to death. However, how could Yi Shiwen be taken lightly? Even an expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm was no match for him. He could effortlessly grab this chief strange fish. It was a piece of cake for him. Roar! The chief fish was caught by Yi Shiwen. It roared, screamed, and struggled. However, Yi Ziwen's giant golden hand had firmly grabbed it. Bang! This huge strange fish was the size of a small mountain, but Yi Shiwen pinched to explosion. It got transformed into a mass of blood fog. Its flesh was absorbed by the heavenly source mirror, and its inner core was absorbed by Yi Shiwen. This replenished the solar system in his universe. His solar system hadn't been perfected yet. Yi Mo was absorbing the accumulated flesh and blood inside the heavenly source mirror. He sat cross-legged as he floated over the blood pond. He constantly extracted the energy from the star colossus so that he could use it to strengthen himself, and upgrade the heavenly source mirror. The heavenly source mirror's combat power was already knocking on the door of the sage realm. It would finally complete the first step of its restoration if it could cross this gateway. Moreover, Yi Mo would be able to condense his own body. He would finally be able to separate his soul from the mirror then. Therefore, Yi Mo was exceptionally careful in upgrading the heavenly source mirror. A majority of the primary spirit dawn they had received in the last 1 year had been absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. So, it had made successive breakthroughs. However, it wasn't that simple to break through to the sage realm. The heavenly source mirror was better than the other divine tools because it was a high-grade tool. It was only broken and incomplete at present, nothing more. However, it could enhance itself as long as there was sufficient energy. This was its biggest advantage. Other divine tools had to face one tribulation after another for each subsequent upgrade. In fact, they must suffer a lot before they could become a sage tool. The sage realm was a very large watershed for martial experts. And, it was same for the divine tools. A tool would gradually begin to gain its own spirit once it had become a sage tool. Thereafter, its strength would increase very significantly. Some tools might even gain their own body like Yi Mo would. No matter whether it was an expert or a divine tool, they would become extraordinary once the sage word was attached to them. Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan were extraordinary. Hua Menghan's flame had effortlessly grabbed the star beasts in that vast area, and had then burnt them to death in one fell swoop. Her attack could deal with a large numbers of enemies with ease. Yi Shiwen had no choice but to admit defeat in front of such an attack. He had no choice but to acknowledge that Hua Menghan was more powerful than him in this regard. The two of them joined forces, and continued to exterminate the beasts along their route. They had soon eradicated the star beasts of this area. However, this was just the beginning. The true martial university was in the vicinity. So, those star beasts weren't considered very strong. They weren't like the Sage Realm and the Great Sage Realm star beasts that were present in the depths of this starry space. They proceeded towards a nearby assembly point. This place was known as the Wind Dragon City. They continued to eradicate the beasts that came in their way. There were many cities in this vast starry space. These cities were treated as nodal points in this mesh of stars. The Wind Dragon City was a nearby assembly point. It was a big city, and had a population of over 1 million. Many experts who traveled in the void would choose these cities to stop over for some time. The Wind Dragon City was regarded as a tyrannical place in the region. It had been reported that the city lord was a senior expert of Great Sage Complete Realm. He was alone a deterring force, and the experts of the nearby areas didn't dare to act presumptuous in front of him. This starry space was similar to the exile places on Earth. Many experts who could no longer stay in the true martial world had escaped into the void. So, the people who came here were often rebellious and unruly fellows. It was impossible to deter these guys without being tyrannical. This starry space might seem close to the true martial world. However, the distance between the chaotic heavenly territory and the true martial world was over 30,000 kilometers. How could it be easy to arrive there? A distance of 30,000 kilometers wouldn't have been a problem if the conditions on the way were normal and stable. However, the presence of star beasts and astral winds had made it a dangerous place. These beasts were always ready to incite trouble. These two had to move side by side, and were forced to exterminate the star beasts they met in order to advance. This would lend them great benefits in the future because exterminating these star beasts was an important task. The true martial university and the other forces undertook this task very seriously. One must know that there was unending internal chaos among the forces of the true martial world. However, they would all unite when it came to dealing with foreign aggression. This foreign aggression was mostly headed by two groups. One was the Devil World. They would poke their nose into the true martial world's affairs from time to time. And the second was the Star Beasts. An enormous threat might be posed for the true martial world if a star colossus were to take birth among these star beasts present in the starry space. After all, what was the reason behind the true martial university's decline? They had opposed the invasion of a star colossus, and had thoroughly declined as a result. This had given an opportunity to the other forces to rise. Therefore, the true martial university and the other forces took it as an important duty to eradicate these star beasts from time to time. They had been collectively killing star beasts for many years. It wasn't easy for a powerful star beast to take birth among these small and weak star beasts. However, there was always such danger. Moreover, these star beasts reproduced very quickly. So, it was required to wipe them out timely. Otherwise, they could pose a huge threat to the true martial world even without the leadership of a star colossus. Moreover, so many of these star beasts would make people's life difficult if they weren't exterminated from time to time. However, no one came to clean up the area frequently. Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan advanced towards the Wind Dragon City, and continued to exterminate the star beasts throughout their route. Chapter 407. The two of them flew towards the Wind Dragon City, and continued to wipe out the star beasts that came in their way. They flew continuously for 10 days and 10 nights, and finally got close to the Wind Dragon City. They didn't take any rest during these 10 days and nights. And, they continued to slaughter the star beasts. Yi Shiwen was unceasingly absorbing the star core either to transform his universe, or to strengthen his principles. He had undergone a number of upgrades in a short span of time. The principles he had recently condensed couldn't be compared with the ones he had done earlier. He had been using the star cores as nourishment. His growth speed had been nearly 10 times that of an average person thanks the non-stop and crazy struggle with these star beasts for 10 whole days. Hua Menghan's cultivation had also become more pure and proficient. She was just one step away from entering the later stage of the semi-sage realm. She was about to enter the later stage of the semi-sage realm. However, this wasn't the biggest surprise for Yi Shiwen. Rather, it was that the restoration process of Heavenly Source Mirror. It had reached the completion of the first step after it had absorbed the flesh and blood of countless star beasts. Yi Mo had dived deeper inside the mirror to complete the restoration. The Heavenly Source Mirror would perhaps be restored to the Sage Realm after the completion of this step. It would be able to provide a huge assistance to Yi Shiwen thereafter. Yi Shiwen would certainly be able to compete with the Sage experts with this Sage tool in his hands once he had entered the later stage of the semi-Sage realm. He wouldn't fall into a disadvantageous situation. However, it must be assumed that his Sage-level opponent wouldn't possess a Sage tool of their own. Not all Sage experts possessed Sage tools. Only the wealthy and outstanding Sage experts kept Sage tools. These two individuals had continuously flown for 10 days and 10 nights. They had flown at full strength, and had unceasingly exterminated the star beasts along the way. An average person would have already died if they were in their place. However, these two weren't ordinary people. The fast regeneration speed of Hua Menghan's heavenly phoenix Bodhi's magical power could frighten anyone. And Yi Zaiwen's gilded tyrant form was extremely intrepid. He had only used his body to beat so many star beasts to death. He hadn't used his real elemental energy at all. Therefore, they didn't have to worry about anything, and forged their path with the blood of the star beasts. There were many other common threats present in this starry sky, such as meteorites, the space turbulence, as well as the rogue chaos that floated in the space, the magnetic field storms, and so on. They hadn't experienced these things in the past. Both of them were Heaven's Pride level experts, but they still had to face great difficulties in dealing with these unusual situations. Yi Shiwen knew about some of these things from his previous life. However, he had never experienced them in person. He had never cared to find out more about them either. After all, he had never thought that he would be walking inside the void of the universe in person. Even a truth-level expert had the ability to survive in the space. However, the sheer amount of dangers present in the space was unimaginable. One would be lost forever if one didn't possess the strength of semi-sage realm. In fact, even the semi-sage experts only dared to travel on the edge of this space, they didn't dare to penetrate inside. The existence of a human expert was too tiny in this vast universe. Yi Shiwen, a turbulent group of meteorites is flying towards us. Hua Menghan gently alerted Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen raised his head to look forward. He saw several thousand meteorites in the distant space. They were rapidly approaching them. It seemed as if there was some kind of unseen attraction force in play that was attracting those meteorites towards them. It seemed like a long-range raid of the meteorites was approaching from very far away. Soon, this group of meteorites wasn't too far from them. These two couldn't hide or dodge even if they tried to. This universe might seem vacuum and empty at one glance. However, it was brimming with all kinds of magnetic fields. The power of these two individuals wasn't enough to send out their divine senses very far away from themselves. That was why they had discovered this group of meteorites only when it had come so close. This was also the reason why they were constantly bumping into star beasts, and were forced to slaughter their way out every time. This was all because the search range of their divine sense wasn't very long. Therefore, there was no way to avoid such meaningless fights. However, there were no formidable star beasts present here, fortunately. These two would rarely come across the star beasts of the semi-sage realm. Moreover, Yi Shiwen could deal with two semi-sage beasts at once without breaking a sweat. "Sister, you take a break first. Let me deal with it." Yi Shiwen laughed out loud and said. "Okay." Hua Menghan smiled as she looked at Yi Shiwen. He was still beaming with energy and vigor, but she looked tired. Each of these experts possessed martial arts within their bodies to keep them energized. Capable experts like these two wouldn't be affected even if they didn't sleep for 1 or 10 years, under normal circumstances. However, fighting continuously like this was a different thing. It must have exhausted their minds. Her heavenly phoenix Bodhis had indeed restored her real elemental energy very quickly. And that would have saved her body from getting tired. However, the exhaustion of one's mind and spirit couldn't be avoided. However, Yi Shiwen was different. His gilded tyrant form was exceptionally tyrannical. He possessed incredible strength even when he didn't use his real elemental energy. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had often come across such long and excruciating battles in the past. His battles had often lasted for several days and several nights. He had experienced the most number of fights among all the Heaven's Pride level experts. He had never experienced the privileged and favorable practice conditions that were bestowed upon the other Heaven's Pride level experts. Rather, he had constantly struggled to slaughter his way up to this level. He was self-made, and had earned his success from the battles he had fought thus far. Fighting for several days and nights was normal for him. Clang! the sword intention appeared in Yi Zaiwen's hand and rumbled loudly. It suddenly expanded and transformed into a huge sword. He then brandished the sword towards those meteorites to chop them down at once. Bang! 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 The sword intention chopped up those meteorites into fine pieces. This task might have been very troublesome for an ordinary expert of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. They could have been knocked down by this group of meteorites if caught off guard. However, it seemed like nothing to Yi Shiwen. Hua Menghan immediately followed after Yi Shiwen as he rushed through that group of meteorites. She said, "You don't consider these meteorites anything, isn't it?" She obviously wasn't afraid of these meteorites either. Her heavenly flame could burn these meteorites to ashes. Even Yi Shiwen had been flattered by her large-scale attack since it could easily take on large groups. In fact, he had been stunned by her ability. However, Yi Shiwen had an upper hand when it came to the ease involved in his way to deal with groups. That was because he didn't need to consume too much real elemental energy, unlike her. Yi Shiwen laughed mischievously and spoke, "Sister, you are flattering me. This is just a sword technique I've recently learnt. It's extremely sharp and swift." Buried person sword. Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. A sword intention appeared in his hand. It appeared like some form of a mystical entity. It then exploded into countless sword shadows. They overwhelmingly spread out towards the group of meteorites to chop them down. Bang! 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 Those meteorites had been chopped and reduced to dust by that bright sword beam. The sight was similar to the most dazzling fireworks in the sky. Yi Shiwen had already practiced the buried sword's secrets to the perfection level. He initially hadn't understood many of the concepts, but he had come to understand them now. The road to practice the swordsmanship to perfection was simply disastrous: buried person, buried earth, buried heaven, and then the great nirvana at last. The great nirvana could break everything in existence, and re-establish a very new great Tao. It had sounded awesome in Yimo's words. However, one couldn't always get the opportunity to practice it to the peak level. The existing world must be shattered and a new sword world must be re-established in order to practice it to the peak level. However, even the thought of that was impossible. The world would have been destroyed countless times in the last 8 billion years if it could be shattered so easily. However, the first 3 moves were still usable. And, the buried sword's secret was still considered as the supreme sword technique. It was the move that had been practiced by the expert who had fought head-on with the star colossus that could swallow planets and stars. It wouldn't have attracted the disciples of the true martial university if it wasn't good enough. "Sister, what do you say? Do you like this technique?" Yi Shiwen asked with a smile. "It's quite fierce. It's difficult to learn and use this supreme technique of sword cultivation." Hua Menghan nodded and said. She felt that Yi Shiwen looked like a child who was happily flaunting his treasure before her. She couldn't help but laugh in her heart. However, she also had a nice fuzzy feeling, as if some ripples were bubbling in her heart. "I can teach you if you wish to learn," Yi Shiwen offered with a smile. "No, I don't need to have a sword cultivation technique. This sword power technique can be a bit beneficial. However, it's nothing in the long run." Hua Menghan shook her head and refused. After all, a majority of people had their own path they must follow. She knew that her road had been paved since the beginning of the awakening of the heavenly phoenix body. It was certainly a fabulous road. However, she didn't have many choices. Moreover, the recent awakening of her blood had presented her with many magical power techniques. They could scare a person to death if displayed. Her cultivation had reached such an extent in such a short span of time. The great contributions of those magical power techniques couldn't be ignored. On the contrary, Yi Shiwen hadn't chosen any path. He possessed a big heart and great ambitions. He wanted to walk on the road of martial arts. He wanted to use all sorts of martial techniques. Merely sticking to one road didn't suit him. Hua Menghan didn't wish to learn. So, Yi Shiwen didn't insist. The understanding between the both of them had advanced by leaps and bounds after they had fought together for several days and nights. The mutual trust between them had also progressed greatly. Yi Xuan wouldn't have said such a thing to her so abruptly in the past. However, it came out of his mouth quite naturally at this moment. Some unknown feelings had started to arouse between them. We must quickly rush to the Wind Dragon City and take proper rest. Hua Menghan's beautiful face revealed traces of exhaustion. Yeah. Yi Xuan nodded. Their speed was extremely fast. They trod on the rainbow light and quickly moved in the empty space. They appeared like a streak of electric light. They had soon flown for another day and night. However, they had started to feel more and more heat for some reason. They looked in the star map, and found a white dwarf in the vicinity. It used to be a star once. However, it had perished and transformed into a white dwarf. So, it was silently hanging nearby. Who are you? Suddenly, a loud shout sounded from afar. A group of warriors came flying out of nowhere. They blocked Yi Xuan and Hua Menghan's path, and glared at them coldly. Chapter 408. Who are you? Suddenly, a loud shout sounded from afar. A group of warriors came out flying out of nowhere. They blocked Yi Xuan and Hua Menghan's way, and coldly glared at them. Who are you two? How dare you come here? Don't you know that this is young Master Feng's restricted territory? One of those individuals flew out and shouted coldly. A bunch of tyrannical divine senses swept all over. Yi Xuan and Hua Menghan immediately became anxious. Hundreds of tyrannical divine senses had performed soul searches across this area all at once. Most of these divine senses belonged to experts of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. However, many among them also belonged to the ones at the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. There was no legendary expert among them. It was quite difficult for legendary experts to move freely in the void of the universe. They could at most travel between some assembly nodal points, that too under the leadership of semi-sage experts only. However, they would basically be a burden. But, Yi Xuan was completely different. He was even more ferocious than the experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Yi Xuan and Hua Menghan hadn't anticipated that they would bump into a gang of experts and meddle with their business. At least hundreds of strong divine senses were floating in the vicinity. And, each one was of the semi-sage level. There was surely a big conspiracy in play since so many semi-sage experts were gathered at one place. And, these two had suddenly intruded into their territory. It was obviously impossible for the opposite party to maintain a good countenance. Excuse us. We had no intention to offend you. Yi Xuan calmly spoke. We will leave immediately. Their priority was to rush to the Wind Dragon City. They would obviously prefer to have one less trouble on the way. You think you can come and go as you want? That's wishful thinking. It just so happens that this man's aptitude is better among these two. He's freely roaming in the space even though he has the trivial strength of the legendary realm. We can capture him and turn him into a slave. And, that woman is extremely beautiful. We can capture her and offer her to young Master Feng as his 326th mistress. Ha ha. He will give us enormous rewards. I'm just afraid these two are probably the disciples of some big school. What are you afraid of? Isn't our young Master Feng using a matrix method to extract the core of that white dwarf? He's also looking for a way to devour the core. He can make a breakthrough into the sage realm after that. Then, he will be able to oppress everyone in this vicinity with his tyranny. There's nothing to be afraid of. These people were discussing without any hesitation in front of Yi Xuan and Hua Menghan. They obviously looked down on these two perhaps because they considered these two individuals to be like the meat placed on a chopping block. It seemed as if they just needed to decide how to chop and when to chop. Yi Xuan immediately raised his eyebrow. An angry look appeared on his face. He hadn't wished to get involved in this matter. However, it seemed like the other party had now given him enough reasons to get involved. Hua Menghan frowned. A disgusted look appeared on her face. The opposite party's obscene words had made her furious. She felt disgusted. "Brothers, attack," one of the experts shouted. Several dozen experts of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm emerged from behind, and surrounded Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. They were looking at the two of them with malicious intentions. They were drooling over the beautiful Hua Menghan in particular. "It seems like we don't have any choice but to slaughter them." Yi Shiwen used his divine sense to communicate this to Hua Menghan. Hua Menghan nodded. Neither of them wanted to indulge in a fight with these people. They didn't want to fight an unnecessary battle. But, these people didn't wish to let them go. "Attack!" Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. "Strike first and gain the upper hand, or suffer." Yi Shiwen knew this well. He shot fire clouds falling sky hand. It appeared like a boundless burning cloud as it advanced towards those people to grab them. These semi-sage experts weren't some ordinary people. They responded almost immediately. "This man has dared to launch an attack on us. He's courting death. I've changed my mind. I don't wish to make him a slave anymore. I want him dead. Destroy his soul too, so that he can never reincarnate again." That semi-sage expert wasn't a good person. He had been enraged by Yi Shiwen. And so, he ordered in an angry manner. The fire clouds falling sky hand went across the vast space. It seemed as if its energy would swallow the entire world. The attack appeared majestic. It seemed as if a heavenly hand had swept down to burn down the whole world. Bang! 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 The attacks of those experts of semi-sage realm were instantly grabbed by the fire clouds falling sky hand, and were crushed into fine powder. However, the hand didn't stop here. The hand then rushed towards those semi-sage experts to grasp them. Bang! 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 Those semi-sage experts were grabbed by Yi Shiwen's fire clouds falling sky hand. Then, he crushed them. Those experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm were turned into blood fog. They were no match for Yi Shiwen. They weren't even as good as those lightning soldiers. Not to mention, Yi Shiwen's strength had increased countless times after he had crossed that heavenly tribulation. Now, he was far more tyrannical than he was before. Hua Menghan had also begun to attack. Her jade hands unleashed several secret seal techniques. The entire world suddenly began to heat up in an abnormal manner. The world began to burn as if it was set on fire. Everything in the radius of 5 kilometers had submerged in a burning sea of silver-white flames. This looked extremely scary. Those experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm didn't get the time to escape. They were burned alive. They were reduced to ashes within seconds. Several experts of the intermediate stage of semi-sage realm couldn't take on these flames either. They met with the same fate. They possessed far more tyrannical skills than those experts of the initial stage of semi-sage realm did. Therefore, they didn't burn to death in an instant like their weaker comrades had. However, it was even more horrible for them since they suffered extreme pain. First, their principles burned down. Then, their bodies, and finally their souls got exterminated. Their obscene words had thoroughly infuriated Hua Menghan. So, she had started to use her most fierce attacks. She hadn't held anything back. These so-called subordinates of young Master Feng didn't know that they had messed with the wrong people this time. However, they quickly realized that these two weren't some random cultivators with no background. One was extremely fierce, while the other was very spicy. "Stop! How dare you attack us? Do you know who we are?" An incomparably terrified semi-sage expert spoke up. He was an expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. He had just played the role of the leader a moment ago. However, he was no match for Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan. These two individuals weren't ordinary people. The ordinary semi-sage realm experts were practically no match for them. Yi Shiwen sneered. The Han seal pounded down from above. This semi-sage realm expert was smashed and turned into blood fog. He couldn't even fight back. He would have never been able to stop Yi Zaiwen's attack. That was because even a causal fist attack of Yi Zaiwen's carried the power released by the combined attacks of dozens of experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. Yi Shiwen slaughtered several experts of semi-sage realm in a matter of moments. They simply didn't stand a chance against these two. They were preparing to leave when suddenly a loud shout sounded, "Who are you two? Do you wish to die?" A big hand cut open the void, and advanced towards Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan to grab them. A terrifying power was boiling upon that hand. This power was invoking a grandiose pressure on those two. Yi Shiwen wasn't deterred one bit. He used his hands to counter. They got shrouded in endless golden light, and ripped that big hand apart. "Sister Hua, let's get out of here quickly," Yi Shiwen shouted. This big hand turned out to be of a peak expert of the later stage of semi-sage realm. Neither of these two could match him. Hua Menghan trod on the rainbow light without any hesitation, and immediately flew away. Her speed wasn't slow, even when compared with the speed of Yi Zaiwen's devil wings. She possessed a top-tier agility technique. She had traveled 1,000 feet in the blink of an eye. Yi Zaiwen's speed wasn't slow either. He opened his devil wings, and followed after Hua Menghan. Bang! That big hand grasped down as soon as Yi Shiwen left. The entire space was caught by that big hand. A large section of the surrounding space collapsed, and the chaos leaked out from the other side. "Damn it! Don't you ever make young Master Feng see you again. Or else," the angry voice of a young man sounded from direction of the White Dwarf. Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan flew away for hundreds of miles. They came to a halt after they realized that nobody was pursuing them. Both of them were gasping for breath. They looked at each other, and burst into laughter. "They wouldn't pursue us till here," Hua Menghan said. "Yes." Yi Shiwen nodded. They had flown hundreds of miles away from there, and the opposite party hadn't pursued them. There was obviously some reason that had kept them there. There must have been a reason why they hadn't chased after these two. Suddenly, Yi Shiwen recalled what one of those experts had said. It seemed like they were about to extract the core of the White Dwarf. One could imagine how precious the core of a star could be. It was the essence of the entire star. The White Dwarf was a dead star. However, its core was still a priceless treasure. However, the entire White Dwarf could explode if one wasn't careful. The power of the explosion would be extremely terrifying. Everyone in the proximity of countless miles would be killed. "Sister, you proceed to the Wind Dragon City. I will join you later," Yi Shiwen said. "What are you going to do?" Hua Menghan asked. "I'm going to give them a pleasant surprise." Yi Shiwen laughed mischievously and stated. His eyes glittered like the tip of a sharp weapon. "That's extremely dangerous. They have an expert of the later stage of the semi-sage realm. And, it seems like there's more than one. You won't be able to deal with them alone." Hua Menghan spoke in a worried tone. "Relax. There won't be a problem. They can't catch me with the kind of speed they possess." Yi Shiwen tried to console Hua Menghan. He wasn't consoling her with nonsense. One must know that an average person couldn't match the speed of Yi Zaiwen's devil wings. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had also perfected his tyrant body technique till the 6th layer. He wasn't an opponent for the opposite party. However, it would be impossible for them to kill him in an instant. And, his Phoenix regeneration technique with its super-fast regeneration speed would quickly restore him back to normal if they weren't able to kill him in an instant. In effect, he wasn't an opponent of the experts of the later stage of semi-sage realm, but they must also give up on the idea of taking him down. "Alright, I will also come with you," Hua Menghan stated. She was still worried for Yi Shiwen. Moreover, the vulgar words of those people had made her extremely angry. "You don't need to come. It will be easier if I go alone. I know that I'm not capable of defeating them. However, they can't take me down either. I wish to give them a pleasant surprise this time. Yi Shiwen stated as he laughed. Chapter 409. Hua Menghan didn't insist after she listened to Yi Shiwen. She knew that Yi Shiwen would only say something like this when he was confident. Several people had said that Yi Shiwen was extremely arrogant and rampant. However, that was only true when he was attacked, and was compelled to counterattack. He wasn't stupid, and his thought process was also reasonable. Yi Shiwen hadn't entered the semi-sage realm yet. However, Hua Menghan knew that Yi Shiwen wasn't inferior to her. In addition, he was far more suitable than her for these circumstances. Yi Shiwen flew back without any hesitation after he had bid farewell to Hua Menghan. He had hidden his presence by operating the restraining breath technique. The golden divine beam on Yi Ziwen's devil wings had been shrouded by thick black fog along with his entire body. Therefore, he could move ahead unseen. He was perfectly camouflaged in this pitch-black space. Yi Shiwen slowly approached that white dwarf. He saw that a massive matrix formation was covering that white dwarf. It looked extremely mysterious. Some incomprehensible energy was wandering inside it. For elderly experts of the later stage of the semi-sage realm were sitting cross-legged around that barrier. They were kneading with their finger to maintain a profound seal technique. A 20-year-old young man was sitting cross-legged over this formation. He looked quite handsome, yet strangely demonic. He was clad in a magnificent robe. The power inside the barrier was bubbling up towards him. His complexion was extremely ugly at this moment. An extremely evil look was present on his handsome face. "Damn it! Don't let me catch you or I will crush your bones and burn you to ashes," the young man said with an evil expression on his handsome face. He was the one who had launched an attack on Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen had managed to escape. The tyrannical expression on his face had distorted his handsome look. He looked extremely frightening. "I will find those two bastards after I'm done swallowing the inner core of the white dwarf and made my breakthrough into the sage realm. They must be killed because they've committed the crime of opposing our Feng clan." Young Master Feng roared like a lion whose tail had been stepped on. "Young Master Feng, don't be impatient. I've already sent out a message out. I've asked our Feng clan's forces to look for the whereabouts of those two individuals. They can't run away. But, they are probably the disciples of one of the forces of the true martial world. This matter can be troublesome later." One of those four old men opened his mouth and spoke. "The true martial world. So what? It doesn't matter who they are, or where they've come from. Those who dare to provoke our Feng clan shall be punished." Young Master Feng roared. Fortunately, he was busy in maintaining the seal technique, and couldn't afford to cause any chaos right now. Young Master Feng will enter the sage realm once he swallows the inner core. Then, he will become the main focus of our clan's resources and nurturing. He will be able to mobilize more experts of our clan. Then, we can even make the true martial world's Heaven's Pride level experts disappear without any traces if they oppose us, another old man spoke. Yi Shiwen pondered. He realized that this Feng clan was probably a huge force in the heavenly chaotic territory. Otherwise, they wouldn't have looked down on the forces of the true martial world. However, young Master Feng still wanted to wait until he had swallowed the inner core. Then, he would start to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen sneered. How he could allow the opposite party to succeed? Yi Shiwen was hidden nearby, and wished to give them a big surprise. However, it might cause a huge problem for him if he allowed the opposite party to enter the sage realm. After all, a person would land himself in big trouble if a sage realm expert was dead set on causing trouble for the said person. Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen suddenly heard a shout. It came from the insides of his mind. This was Yi Mo's voice. Yi Shiwen was pleasantly surprised by this and said, "How did you wake up so soon?" Weren't you upgrading yourself to a sage tool? I've already completed the upgradation process. The heavenly source mirror has become a sage tool now. Yi Mo laughed and said. That's great. Yi Xuan also laughed out loud and replied. Several limitations that had previously existed have vanished since it has become a sage tool. Yi Mo spoke as he laughed. We can now push the level of that blood slave to the later stage of the semi-sage realm. Then, nobody will be able to match the blood slave, unless a sage expert appears. Yi Xuan suddenly felt relaxed. He would have far more assurance if he had the assistance of a blood slave of the later stage of the semi-sage realm. He had previously planned that he would leave after he had stolen the white dwarf's inner core. But now, he didn't wish to leave without dealing a serious blow to these experts. Yi Xuan went inside the heavenly source mirror after he had made the decision. The world inside the heavenly source mirror had suddenly expanded by 10 times after it had become a sage tool. It appeared endless. In fact, it appeared like a small continent. It certainly wasn't the size of the world in itself. However, it was big enough for Yi Xuan. Yi Xuan arrived at the edge of the blood pond. That star colossus was still boiling inside the blood pond, but it had become very weak. The suppression force of the heavenly source mirror had grown after it had become a sage tool. So, it didn't even have enough power to struggle. Its entire body was bound in a chain of magical symbols made up of principles. Its strength was being sucked away, little by little. It could only stare at Yi Xuan with hatred, nothing more. It didn't even have the energy to roar. Yi Xuan could now do many things since the heavenly source mirror had become a sage tool. And, the first thing he would do was to forcefully level up the blood slave. Yi Xuan sat cross-legged over the blood pond. He stretched out his big hand, and grabbed several principles. He condensed magical symbol out of the principles, and instilled them inside the blood slave. The Tao principles flooded into the blood slave. Its aura started to become more powerful. It became more and more formidable with every passing moment. The primary spirit dawn were unceasingly burning inside the heavenly source mirror. The transformed spirit energy was being instilled into the blood slave. 200. 300. 400. 500. The time passed in the outside world, second by second, minute by minute. Almost a month had passed in the blink of an eye. The unceasing extraction of the white dwarf's inner core was still taking place. This was a very big task. Therefore, nobody was acting impatiently in this regard. Yi Xuan was still lurking nearby. He was constantly condensing principles in order to instill them into the blood slave. The blood slave could even be promoted to the sage realm since the heavenly source mirror had become a sage tool. However, Yi Xuan didn't have enough energy to make that happen. Therefore, he could only condense approximately 800 Tao principles. There was no way to make the blood slave break through to the sage realm. However, it was temporarily good enough for the current Yi Xuan. It was enough for him to give them a big surprise. Time passed slowly. Yi Xuan felt that the white dwarf was getting hotter and hotter. It slowly began to disseminate enormous amounts of heat. Bang! A loud explosion occurred. Endless amount of lava began to erupt from that white dwarf. The lava soared into the space for tens of thousands of feet. Suddenly, Yi Xuan had a cold feeling in his heart. He realized that these guys had genuinely managed to force out the inner core. Then, the inner core began to condense by absorbing the essence of the entire star. The terrifying force caused an endless amount of lava to erupt and disperse in the space. This was an extremely frightening scene. However, a cheerful look appeared on the faces of those experts of the Feng clan. Young Master Feng was also jubilant at the sight. After all, he had finally begun to see the result of his long-drawn efforts. He could rise to great heights once he swallowed the inner core and became a sage expert. He would obviously become very different from his present mere semi-sage expert then. There simply was no comparison between the two. His present status in the Feng clan couldn't be compared with the one he would relish at that time. This white dwarf had taken birth after its parent star had died. It was the same as the other things in this world, it also went from the time of its birth to that of its flourish, and then, to its death. It couldn't escape from the laws of life and death even though it was a star. However, the lifespan of these stars was much greater than that of an average person's. They could easily last for billions of years. These stars were a source of light in the universe. This star had died and turned into a white dwarf, but it still contained incredible power. Young Master Feng had used a special method to condense that power into the extracted inner core. And, the core contained enough energy to help him step into the sage realm in one fell swoop. One could only imagine the kind of energy contained in it. The white dwarf exploded. It suddenly emitted incredible light and heat. It seemed as if it had suddenly reached the peak of its prosperity once again. It illuminated all directions. One would only assume it to be daylight when they'd gaze at the sky from the true martial world. This special flash of starlight was precisely the dying flash of this star. The accumulated energy had burst out in a flash. And, this was only the inner core of a dead star. It was simply impossible to imagine the amount of power the inner core of a mature star would possess. Let alone the inner core of a massive world like the true martial world. The inner core of the white dwarf contained a massive amount of energy. However, the inner core was merely the size of a fist. A tiny inner core like this one possessed such enormous energy. Young Master Feng couldn't resist anymore. He rushed towards that tiny inner core of the white dwarf. He had wanted to obtain the inner core of this white dwarf since long. He had been waiting here for several years in order to find an opportunity to obtain it. This inner core had finally emerged. So, it was finally the time to obtain it. An overjoyed expression appeared on his face. Yi Shiwen had remained hidden for quite a long time. However, he finally moved into action at this time. He stretched out his big golden palm towards that inner core to grab it. Chapter 410. This type of a white dwarf had previously been unattainable to some extent. After all, the universe was incredibly huge. There were many stars in the sky. However, every star was situated very far away, more so in the case of a dead star. One would obtain many benefits if one could grab it. In fact, the benefits were almost beyond one's imagination. However, it was quite difficult for an average person to come across such resource. The legendary realm was considered as ordinary in the heavenly chaotic territory. Legendary experts were treated as ordinary people. The semi-sage realm possessed the same status. However, the sage realm was different. The sage experts obtained everyone's respect and attention wherever they went. Some were even the lords of some remote areas, and ruled their respective territories without any problem. Sage realm was like a watershed. People below the sage realm were like ants, and were considered as ordinary existence. Only outstanding people could become sage experts by transcending their ordinary mortal lives. Their lifespans could also increase from 1,000 years of the legendary realm to 2,000 years in one fell swoop. And, this inner core was the biggest opportunity to achieve that. There was greed in young Master Feng's eyes. He had spent 10 years of his life to make arrangements in order to obtain this inner core. He had to find several important materials which were required for putting up the matrix formation. Finally, he had managed to extract this inner core after a year's time. He would transform after he had swallowed it. He would transform into a dragon from a fish, and hence become extraordinary. The other old men felt somewhat envious as they watched him. However, their moods suddenly changed, and their feelings of jealousy disappeared. They knew what stuff they could dip their fingers in, and where they couldn't. And, this was definitely not something they should covet. However, just when young Master Feng was about to grab the inner core, a big golden hand appeared out of nowhere, and stole the inner core in front of him. Young Master Feng was left dumbstruck by this sudden turn of events. He couldn't control his anger, and immediately became furious. He had struggled for 10 years in order to obtain this inner core. And someone else had appeared and snatched it away when it was the time to taste the fruit of his labors. How could this not make him furious? Attack! A loud shout sounded. Suddenly, a terrifying blood light condensed into a blood man. This bloody figure swept out its palm towards young Master Feng to slap him. Bang! This palm attack was devastating, and it seemed as if the world itself had been shattered. The void had been crumbled and eroded by the blood light. The terrifying force began to boil, and pressed down upon young Master Feng's body. It destroyed his protective energy barrier, and crushed the bones in his chest. Puff! Blood spurted out of young Master Feng's body as he was sent flying in the space. Nobody had seen what had really happened. They only saw him getting blown away by an explosion. He didn't lose his consciousness. But there was rage in his eyes since they could only stare helplessly as a stranger stole the White Dwarf's inner core. Yi Xuan had grabbed the White Dwarf's inner core. The White Dwarf was extremely hot, but its inner core wasn't. It should be mentioned that all the energy was condensed inside the inner core. It would discharge an enormous power if it exploded. Who are you? The other 4 experts of the later stage of Semi-Sage Realm asked. They hadn't paid much attention earlier since they didn't care much. They indeed seemed excited at first. However, that was just excitement, nothing more. After all, they knew that the inner core didn't belong to them. They were merely protecting it by holding the barrier up. However, this sudden turn of events had left their minds vacant. They found out that young Master Feng had been sent flying out before they could understand what was going on. Those 4 experts of the later stage of the Semi-Sage Realm rushed towards Yi Xuan. However, there was a large distance between them and Yi Xuan. The White Dwarf had already dried up. However, it had still spread over 10,000 kilometers. In other words, these people were separately seated over 10,000 kilometers away from the center since they were maintaining the matrix formation. They hadn't anticipated that they would come across a surprise attack. Yi Xuan had already killed the people who were guarding this place. Therefore, nobody was alarmed when Yi Xuan arrived. They had no way to catch Yi Xuan. Yi Xuan sneered as he looked at young Master Feng and shouted, "Die!" Young Master Feng had planned to cause trouble for him after he had become a sage expert. The best approach was to root out the weed before it could spread. Yi Xuan could kill him by taking the advantage of the fact that the other semi-sage experts would take time to arrive here. Even an expert of the later stage of the semi-sage realm would need a considerable amount of time to cover 10,000 kilometers. And Yi Xuan could take the advantage of this time gap. Yi Xuan shouted, "Die," and turned into a golden lightning. He then flew towards young Master Feng to kill him. Young Master Feng began to burn with anger after he realized that Yi Xuan hadn't only snatched his inner core, but also wanted to kill him. He took a medicinal pill out of his spatial ring, and swallowed it. One could clearly see that the injuries on his entire body had been repaired quite quickly. It might be assumed that this was an extremely precious medicinal pill. An ordinary person would use one very carefully. They wouldn't consume without thinking about it first. They wouldn't dare to use it so extravagantly like he had. However, young Master Feng was facing a life-or-death situation. So, he had to make a quick choice. He didn't care whether it was being wasted or not. You're courting death. Don't even think about getting away alive. Young Master Feng bellowed, "Wind Spirit Seal Technique." Young Master Feng kneaded his fingers, and a seal technique suddenly appeared. The power of countless wind spirits gathered in the space, and formed a massive seal technique. Then, this attack charged towards Yi Xuan. Bang! The wind spirit seal smashed down at a very fast speed. Yi Xuan was unable to avoid this attack, and got hit head-on. He nearly collapsed by the impact of this attack, and blood gushed out from his body. Yi Xuan was in a shock. These experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm were very different, especially young Master Feng. He clearly belonged to a big clan. He was an outstanding talent. He was extremely quick, and it had been very difficult to evade his attack. However, Yishuan didn't know that young Master Feng was even more shaken than him. He had inherited this Wind Spirit Seal technique from his Feng clan. He knew that it was extremely powerful, and also very quick and swift. This attack could have pounded an average person into meat sauce. However, only a golden sword light flashed when it pounded on Yishuan. He sustained heavy injuries as a result of this attack. Nothing more happened. It couldn't make him collapse. Young Master Feng could tell that this guy had a very powerful body. Young Master Feng was in shock, but his Wind Spirit Seal technique didn't slow down one bit. It formed a huge seal, and pounded towards Yishuan. However, Yishuan's response wasn't slow either. He wasn't going to fall for the same trick again. A Han seal appeared. It transformed into a giant dragon, and rushed towards the incoming Wind Spirit Seal. Bang! Two great seal techniques collided incredibly in the space. The aftermath spread everywhere, and shattered the void. It seemed as if the entire space was crumbling. It looked very frightening. Yishuan's Han seal was a bit stronger than the Wind Spirit Seal technique. However, Yishuan's martial power was far inferior to young Master Feng's. Therefore, Yishuan fell into a disadvantageous situation in the end. The terrifying gap in the power shook Yishuan's body. It slightly swayed his body despite his gilded tyrant form. An average person's body would have disintegrated instantly. However, Yishuan only felt a burst of vibrations in his body. Roar! A blood dragon roared. The blood slave had finally moved into action by taking the advantage of the fight between Yishuan and young Master Feng. It shot its palm with a rumbling sound, and a blood dragon emerged out. It was a move of Coiling Dragon Palm. This move was called Hidden Dragon Rises from the Abyss. However, it was entirely different from Yishuan's grandiose Golden Dragon. The blood slave's blood dragon was condensed from endless scarlet energy. It was as fierce and violent as Yishuan's Golden Dragon. However, this blood dragon was more ominous and evil-looking than a grandiose golden dragon. The blood dragon roared loudly. The sound's vibrations shook the entire universe. Its fierce claws ripped apart the vast space as it arrived beside young Master Feng and destroyed his defense. And then, it arrived in front of young Master Feng. Bang! Young Master Feng was sent flying in the space by the terrifying power of the blood dragon. His throat sustained injuries, and he spouted a mouthful of blood. He might not have cared about Yishuan's attacks much. Indeed, it was being quite difficult for him to kill Yishuan. However, he hadn't thought that Yishuan would respond in this way. He couldn't underestimate the blood slave's attack since it was at the late stage of the semi-sage realm, just like him. Moreover, he himself had merely condensed 700 Tao principles, while the blood slave had condensed 750. In short, it was a bit more tyrannical than him. He was still thinking about means to deal with these two when Yishuan suddenly arrived in front of him. A Han seal pounded towards him above. Bang! Young Master Feng didn't get time to dodge, and the Han seal pounded on him. He once again spouted blood. His body went flying upside down in the space. Stop! Brat, you're courting death. Do you know who we are? You have committed a serious offense by offending our Feng clan. The people of our clan will wipe out your 9 generations. Those 4 experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm were dumbstruck as they witnessed this scene. The situation had undergone an incredible change in just a few moments. Young Master Feng wasn't weak. His strength wasn't just for show's sake. He was more powerful than any of them. However, he didn't have the power to fight back when he came under the attacks of these 2 strange individuals. He had been reduced to such a desperate state in a mere matter of a few rounds of fighting. This was impossible in their opinion. These people had reached the late stage of the semi-sage realm. They were only half a step away from entering the sage realm. They would then transcend their mortal lives. Therefore, they were well aware of the limitations of their own strength. They would believe if someone were to say that he could kill them. However, they couldn't accept the fact that someone could effortlessly beat them into a dead dog. The joint attack of a young expert of legendary realm and a strange red creature had forced young Master Feng into such a miserable state in a short period of time. They felt like they were witnessing a myth with their own eyes. Chapter 411. There was a significant difference between Yi Shiwen's and young Master Feng's cultivation levels. They were in different realms, and their real strengths also differed by a bit. However, Yi Shiwen, Gilded Tyrant form, had minimized these differences to a certain extent. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had also integrated the Heavenly Source Mirror into his body now. So, his defense had increased considerably. It certainly wasn't an ordinary thing to have a sage tool protecting one's body. Now, he could allow the enemy's attacks to hit his body, and could use the opportunity to focus more on attacking. Indeed, it was quite difficult for an expert with the strength of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm to injure the expert of the late stage of semi-sage realm. However, how could Yi Shiwen be taken lightly? His one strike was equivalent to the combined attack of dozens of experts of the intermediate stage of semi-sage realm. Even an expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm would have to avoid his strong attacks. Yi Shiwen's strength had increased by multiple times after the Heavenly Source Mirror had upgraded to become a sage tool. In fact, experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm who only possessed 500 or 600 Tao principles had no means to deal with him. Even a semi-sage expert like young Master Feng with 700 Tao principles appeared like a helpless stray dog when faced with the joint attacks of Yi Shiwen and the Blood Slave. It's impossible. A look of panic appeared on young Master Feng's face. He unceasingly was stuffing medicines in his mouth. However, he was still being pushed back by the joint attacks of Yi Shiwen and Blood Slave. The Blood Slave was the creation and puppet of Yi Shiwen. Naturally, their minds were interlinked. They had a tacit understanding, and were coordinating their attacks to perfection. Bang! 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 Young Master Feng had fallen into a disadvantageous position. He had turned into a sandbag under the combined attacks of Yi Shiwen and the Blood Slave. He simply didn't have the means to resist their attacks. He couldn't even catch up with them. Yi Shiwen and the Blood Slave were using devil wings, and their speed was extremely fast. The other old experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm saw young Master Feng being blown around like a sandbag between a golden light and a blood light. Stop! Those elders trembled with fear as they saw this scene. They were afraid that young Master Feng would get killed at this rate. That would be horrible. Bang! Young Master Feng was again sent flying by an attack. The bones throughout his body had been shattered after getting bombarded several times. It was a very tragic scene. An incomparably ominous look appeared on young Master Feng's face. His handsome face had been already beaten into a pig's. The grim look had distorted his face. Just you wait, I won't let you off. Young Master Feng roared. He wasn't going to give up. He clenched his teeth to demonstrate his anger. Then, he took out a scroll from his spatial ring, and crushed it to pieces. The scroll transformed into a pitch-black portal after getting crushed. It looked as if it was imitating the darkness of the void. A profound aura was wrapped around this huge portal. Young Master Feng flew into the portal without any delay. And, the portal disappeared immediately after that. Yi Shiwen was taken aback. He hadn't expected that young Master Feng would possess a transmission portal. It wasn't surprising why that ominous and begrudged expression had appeared on his face. One must know that only the sage experts were capable of using their energy to split open a crack in the space. However, it would be a dead end for them if they were to rush inside it. Only the great sage experts were capable of establishing a transmission array formation for traveling from one point in space to another. In fact, such a thing could only be done by those great sage experts who possessed a good understanding regarding these transmission array formations. Moreover, tens of hundreds of experts would be required to form an array formation in order to travel longer distances. The space was an extremely mysterious thing for any individual. Even the peak-level expert of Great Sage Realm couldn't create a transmission scroll. Yi Shiwen didn't know how this young Master Feng had obtained this transmission scroll. However, the appearance of that begrudged expression on his face clearly indicated that he wasn't going to give up. He wouldn't have used such a precious item if his own life weren't in danger. Yi Shiwen didn't idle for another second. He collected the blood slave, and left treading on the rainbow light. Those 4 old experts roared in anger, and rushed after him. Yi Shiwen's intention was very clear. He had succeeded in bullying a bully like young Master Feng with the help of the blood slave. However, things would have become quite difficult for Yi Shiwen if those 4 old experts had interfered. Yi Shiwen was very fast. He quickly disappeared from their line of sight. And, they could only curse him out of frustration since they didn't have any means to catch him. Yi Shiwen burst into laughter after he heard them curse behind his back. His mood became extremely jubilant. He was happy to have taught these guys a lesson, especially after they had openly threatened him by stating that they'd come after his life. He had also managed to steal the inner core of a star. He was certainly in a very good mood. He rushed towards the Wind Dragon City as per the directions he had seen in the star map. The Wind Dragon City was widely famous in the nearby regions. It was said that this city was built on the corpse of a huge wind dragon. However, this was just a rumor. Nobody knew whether it was true or false. This Wind Dragon City was established thousands of years ago. Its city lord had also been changed several times. The ordinary people didn't know much about the history of the city. They also didn't know what the situations had been at the time of this city's establishment. Yi Shiwen flew at a fast speed for one day, and eventually arrived at the Wind Dragon City. The Wind Dragon City appeared like a city that stood on a small island in the space. It appeared exceptionally special in this silent and dark universe. Yi Shiwen stopped to rest for a while. He saw several martial experts roaming about in the city. Many of these experts were at the legendary realm. However, the semi-sage experts were also present in abundance. Several such experts could be seen from time to time. Yi Shiwen could also spot disciples of the true martial university. Even disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall and other forces of the true martial world were present. Yi Shiwen contacted Hua Menghan immediately after he reached the Wind Dragon City. However, she was at the city central arena at this time. Yi Shiwen received Hua Menghan's message, and promptly rushed towards the city central arena. This arena was very famous in the Wind Dragon City. People would often go to this arena to challenge the experts who arrived in this city from various places. The Wind Dragon City was merely one city. However, its citizens had come from the true martial world, and various other regions of the chaotic heavenly territory. It was a small city, but one could find all sorts of experts here. Therefore, experts would often emerge in this arena. Yi Shiwen hurriedly proceeded towards the arena. He saw 2 figures fighting in the arena. One among them was tall, he was approximately 30 years old. And, the other one was a child, he was approximately 11 or 12 years old. This child's skin was as fair as snow. He appeared exceptionally adorable. However, his face was covered with a brutal expression. Yi Shiwen spotted Hua Menghan in the crowd. She wasn't far from him. Yi Shiwen promptly went towards her and greeted, "Sister Hua." "Ah, you are here. Are you all right?" Hua Menghan asked somewhat concerned. "Of course, I'm all right." Yi Shiwen told her everything about how he stole young Master Feng's star core. "Sister Hua, our cultivation will advance by leaps and bounds after we absorb the inner core. We will make huge progress." "Well, why have you come here?" Yi Shiwen asked somewhat puzzled. However, he didn't wait for Hua Menghan's reply since the arena had suddenly undergone tremendous changes. That 30-year-old man retreated several steps after facing that child's attack. In fact, he couldn't find a foothold. Bang! A palm struck that man's chest. His ribs broke, and he was sent flying upside down. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but gasp. He could see that this child didn't belong to some dwarf race or anything. He was only an 11 or 12-year-old kid. However, he possessed shockingly tyrannical strength. That middle-aged man possessed the strength of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. However, he was no match for this kid. One palm attack of this kid had knocked him out of the arena. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but be shocked after he witnessed a young teenager demonstrate such tyrannical strength. This Pang Yongbo is extremely strong. Even a semi-sage realm expert has lost to him. He's far more than just strong. He's an evil genius. He's just 11 years old. These so-called geniuses should die with shame since they are all bullshit in front of this child prodigy. Anyone will die from anger and frustration if they compare themselves with him. How can there be such a peerless genius among so many geniuses that exist in this world? Yeah. No one can find Pang Yongbo's match among the younger generation disciples of Xian Yuan Palace Hall. We can trace back to hundreds of thousands of years to make the comparison, but we still won't find someone as talented. He doesn't appear that incredible to me. I have heard that he had obtained a mysterious inheritance at a very young age. Otherwise, it is impossible to become so powerful so quick. Some people also say that he's the reincarnation of a great figure from ancient times. That's why he can cultivate so quickly. But, he is a peerless disciple of this generation. Everyone's discussions reached Yi Shiwen's ears. He found out that this kid was a disciple of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. It could be said that the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had picked up a gem this time. Pang Yongbo's face exposed a somewhat bitter expression. He shouted, "Is this the level of true Martial University's disciples? How pathetic. I'm very disappointed. They are just trash, nothing else. Why hasn't that Yi Shiwen come out yet? I will wait for another 3 months in this arena. If someone knows him, then tell him that this young master has summoned him over for a fight. Just see how I blow him off to oblivion." Yi Shiwen finally understood why Hua Menghan had arrived here. This kid's hatred was actually directed towards Yi Shiwen. A bitter expression appeared on the faces of those surrounding disciples of the true Martial University as they heard Pang Yongbo's words. Several disciples of the true Martial University were present in the arena. They obviously felt very agitated upon hearing these words. Several disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall were also present here. They simultaneously clamored on the contrary. Tell that Yi Shiwen to come out. That's if he has the guts to take on this challenge. Yi Shiwen figured that the disciples who belonged to different forces hadn't begun to establish contacts with each other yet. So, his name mustn't have reached Xian Yuan Palace Hall. And, these disciples of Xian Yuan Palace were clearly hostile towards him. This must be because he had killed Fan Ming. That fight between Yi Shiwen and Fan Ming could be regarded as the collision between the top disciples of the younger generation of the true Martial University and the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. And, Yi Shiwen had killed Fan Ming in the end. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall's people certainly weren't willing to accept this. Chapter 412. Not many forces of the true martial world could be placed at the same level as the true Martial University. However, some could be. And, a majority of these forces had immense and deep-seated hatred toward the true Martial University. They didn't get along with each other. In fact, each force would look for every possible method to weaken the strength of the other forces. There was huge conflict between the true Martial University and the Xian Yuan Palace Hall in particular. It couldn't have been bigger than it already was. The true Martial University had dominance over the southern region. Many forces were jealous because of this. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall was a force of the Central Plains, and was located south of Yellow River. They were in close proximity, and this had made them hostile towards the true Martial University. The disciples of these two forces were more hostile towards each other than they were towards the disciples from other regions. Yi Xuan's name had begun to spread inside the Xian Yuan Palace Hall after he had killed Fan Ming. The competition in the Xian Yuan Palace Hall was also very intense, just like true martial university. Countless people would attentively watch the state of competitions among the Heaven's Pride level experts. Fan Ming's sudden death had come as a big shock. This had caused a huge sensation in the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. However, the Xian Yuan Palace Hall didn't pay much attention to this matter since they couldn't rise in revolt against the true martial university. It seemed as if this matter had been left unsettled. However, Yi Xuan had become very famous in the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. Each disciple of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had come to know that Yi Xuan had killed one of their Heaven's Pride level experts. Consequently, they began to look for him to cause trouble. Several Heaven's Pride level experts of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall hadn't yet competed against one another. Therefore, it was difficult to decide who was stronger and who was weaker. However, since Yi Xuan had killed Fan Ming, so, one wouldn't have to do anything else to prove that they were the best among all Heaven's Pride level experts if they could defeat or kill Yi Xuan. Wouldn't they become famous very quickly? Yi Xuan decided to pass through this crucial situation. And, it was somewhat indeed a strange one. However, it did make some sense as to why they would aim for him. This situation was very similar to the one that had arisen after he had killed the second god. Many people had come to believe that he was the top expert in the younger generation. This child is hateful. Hua Menghan had become somewhat angry. Her beautiful face had turned slightly red because of anger. Yi Xuan smiled and said, I can handle him. Be careful. He's extremely arrogant, but he doesn't seem ordinary. Hua Menghan whispered to him. Yeah. Yi Xuan nodded. He looked calm. However, he wouldn't underestimate this child either. No, it wasn't a joke for him. How could he look down on an 11 or 12 years old child who had such cultivation? It was enough to make other Heaven's Pride level experts die with shame. However, Yi Xuan wasn't dejected by this. His own cultivation speed wasn't slower than this child's. This road was very long, and this was just a beginning, nothing more. It was just a short-lived fad, nothing more. Only the most talented person would have the final laugh. It seems that the true martial university's disciples are trash. Pang Yongbo laughed coldly. His small face was covered with a disdainful expression. Yi Xuan slowly walked out of the crowd, and stepped into the arena. He said, even a child can become famous when there are no heroes around. A brat like you who hasn't even grown hair down there, should first learn how to fight and kill. Ha 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 ha. Ha ha ha. Several experts burst into laughter after they listened to Yi Xuan's words. Many people among these experts hated this arrogant Pang Yongbo. No one's ever fond of an arrogant person. However, they didn't dare to provoke him. This child had slapped several experts of the semi-sage realm a moment ago, and had sent them flying. They were no match for him. However, those experts couldn't control themselves, and burst into laughter after they saw someone daring to provoke him. An incomparably bitter look appeared in the eyes of the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. Pang Yongbo's age was his highlight, as well as his most vulnerable spot. And, Yi Xuan had poked him where it hurts the most. Who are you? Yi Xuan's words had made Pang Yongbo's small face turn deep red. He was extremely furious. He would get enraged whenever someone talked about his age. I'm Yi Xuan. Yi Xuan smiled indifferently, and said, I wouldn't have bothered to haggle with a child. But, I'm not so heartless as to see a child wait for 3 months in the arena. So, I came out. Do you wish to die? Pang Yongbo's complexion had turned gloomy and ugly. It seemed if he would start crying any moment now. Yi Xuan had already poked his sensitive spot twice or thrice. Oh ho, you also have a bit of bad temper. Yi Xuan laughed out loud and said, but, even your anger is as half-assed as a child's. Shut up. I only had the intention to suppress you in order to show you your place. But now, your death is certain. Pang Yongbo stated. He had clearly been enraged out of shame. You wish to suppress me? Forget about it, brat. Why don't you first grow some hair down there? Yi Shiwen laughed mischievously. He was deliberately saying such poisonous words. Everyone laughed. Hua Menghan also smiled a little. Her delicate body shook gently. She had never seen Yi Shiwen smile so mischievously, or use such poisonous words at someone. Damn it! You have made me very angry today. You will certainly die. Pang Yongbo's complexion turned ashen. It seemed as if tears would roll down from his eyes any moment now. He thundered and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if his anger would pierce through the space. His tyrannical strength left everyone to tremble with fear. Yi Shiwen had poked him again and again. This had made him lose face in front of everyone. He began to knead a seal technique with his hands. It produced a lightning which seemingly split open the entire world. It illuminated the void, and swept towards Yi Shiwen to chop him down. This is the magical power of a supreme thunder technique. It seems that this Pang Yongbo has obtained a wonderful book, 9 Temples 5 Elements Thunder Book. It is the most exquisite thunder technique. Some people even say that he's the reincarnation of the thunder god. I've heard this rumor too. This 11 years old semi-sage expert is truly astounding. It has also been said that he possesses the extraordinary blood of the chaotic heaven thunder body. This means that he must have reaped exceptional benefits by practicing his own thunder cultivation method. Not to mention that 9 Temples 5 Elements Thunder Book would enhance his power even further. An average person can't match him. I say his insane progress speed is strange. Humph. Yi Shiwen snorted. His hands got covered with golden divinities. He didn't dodge or avoid. He charged towards the incoming lightning, and grabbed them. Other people would have been very scared of such a thunder technique. However, it was nothing in front of Yi Shiwen since he had used the lightning energy of heterogeneous heavenly tribulations to temper his body. Bang! 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 Yi Shiwen's palm exploded those lightning. And, the terrifying force from his hands swept out energy storms everywhere. The lightning attack was straightaway crushed by Yi Shiwen. It couldn't pose any threat to him. Someone immediately opened his mouth in shock after he saw Yi Shiwen fight in such a relaxed manner. He said, so this is Yi Shiwen. He's really outstanding. He just used his bare hands to tackle Pang Yongbo's lightning attack. His body is insanely tough. That's true. One of the earlier opponents didn't even get the time to evade the attack. His flesh had been lacerated, and his blood had splashed out as a result. There seems like a huge difference of power between these two. That's not true, an informed disciple of the true martial university spoke up somewhat proudly, that Pang Yongbo isn't an ordinary person. Our Yi Shiwen isn't an ordinary person either. He has the strongest body in our true martial university. Even the famous Titan body lost and died in his hands. His body is invincible. Nobody can stand in front of him. Titan body suffered a major defeat and got killed in the end. But, he was very powerful. After all, he was of a rare bloodline, and had the invincible body of a Titan. However, he still turned out to be inferior to Yi Shiwen. I must say that this Yi Shiwen is unbearably strong. This child is extremely arrogant. He has provoked Yi Shiwen. He will soon start to cry once he realizes that he has messed with the wrong guy. Ha ha ha, that disciple of the true martial university burst into laughter after he was done talking. He was no longer sour about his earlier defeat at the hands of Pang Yongbo. He can only deal with an invincible expert like Yi Shiwen if he can suppress him with some supreme magical powers. Otherwise, he doesn't stand a chance. Pang Yongbo became even angrier after he saw that Yi Shiwen had effortlessly destroyed his offensive. He knew that Yi Shiwen wasn't an ordinary person. After all, Fan Ming had lost and died in his hands. So he couldn't possibly be an ordinary guy. However, Pang Yongbo still looked down on Yishuan. The experts like this child felt like the whole world was in their palm since they had remained at the peak for a long time. Hence, they could be called extremely arrogant and lawless. What authority? What reputation? Everything was bullshit. Only one's fist was the strongest. A majority of so-called Heaven's Pride level experts used to think like this. Pang Yongbo's countenance had turned even colder. An endless amount of lightning was boiling and surging on his body. It seemed as if he was attracting the wandering lightning like a conductor. The thunder and lightning were objects most people always maintained a respectful distance from. However, they appeared obedient and docile in his hands. Numerous seals dazzled in his hands. Countless thunders and lightning condensed into dozens of giant thunder dragons as per his will. Then, those giant dragons started to roar in anger. The surrounding space shook. The claws of these dragons could grab and explode the space. They were exceptionally terrifying. The onlookers were left in shock by this spectacle. Nobody had thought that Pang Yongbo could be this strong. Each of these dragons could be compared with an expert of the semi-sage realm. However, dozens of such thunder dragons had conveniently condensed at his will. None of his previous opponents had been able to force him to display his true strength. However, he had displayed the extent of his strength in this battle. His tyrannical strength had left everyone in shock. Yishuan was also somewhat dumbstruck. It wasn't difficult to practice till the intermediate stage if one had talent. But, one might not become a Heaven's Pride level expert even though they had practiced till the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. In fact, many experts of the younger generation had practiced till the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm. However, there were only a few Heaven's Pride level experts. The reason was quite simple. It was because of the disparity in their strengths. One Heaven's Pride level expert could easily beat dozens of experts of the same realm. Heaven's Pride level experts could stand tall against all the other top experts of the same realm. These were the traits of a real Heaven's Pride level expert. Pang Yongbo was very young. However, he was truly an evil genius since he had displayed such strength. Moreover, his chaotic heaven thunder body was really outstanding. These thunder dragons simultaneously revealed their ferocious features. They soared up and fluttered around in the space. The massive thunder dragons gathered around Yishuan and surrounded him. Then, they swept down towards Yishuan. Each of these dragons was exceptionally scary. Yishuan snorted and rushed forward like a ferocious beast. Chapter 413. Yishuan's glowing golden hands emitted waves of golden light. It ripped apart the space, and advanced ahead. Suddenly, one of the thunder dragons opened its big mouth, and rushed towards Yishuan to bite him. Yishuan's big hand grabbed and then pinched the neck of that thunder dragon. Its neck instantly snapped. Its body transformed into a bundle of energy, and this energy was then absorbed by Yishuan. Humph! Babies shouldn't act so arrogantly. Yishuan sneered. Then, he straightaway dashed into that group of thunder dragons. Pang Yongbo is indeed outstanding. But, it's not easy to deal with Yishuan either. The rumors say that Yishuan has killed a Heaven's Pride level expert of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. This has attracted the attentions of many of their people towards him. It's not surprising why the Xian Yuan Palace Hall has suddenly gone bonkers to take Yishuan down. It's far from being just crazy. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the true Martial University aren't on friendly terms. These two wouldn't have acted kindly towards each other even without this underlying matter. Both of these individuals are extremely ferocious. An ordinary semi-sage expert can't even withstand a move from these two, he'd get blown away by their attack. Pang Yongbo can be regarded as an evil genius at such a young age. Nobody will be able to dominate him when he matures. Even that Yishuan, who is said to have killed 2 Heaven's Pride level experts already, may not stand a chance. Those thunder dragons swept down towards Yishuan like huge mountains to crush him. The space crumbled wherever they went. However, Yishuan dashed straight into them without caring about anything. Bang! Yishuan's one kick exploded a thunder dragon. An ordinary expert of the late stage of semi-sage realm would have regretted facing these thunder dragons head-on. However, Yishuan was treating them as if they were no big deal. Bang! 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 Each time a dragon got slayed by Yishuan, it was accompanied by the loud sound of an explosion. Yishuan gradually began to comprehend the so-called Dragon Slayer technique as he killed more and more thunder dragons. It was a supreme and terrifying secret technique. Its brilliance used to prevail in the ancient world. However, this secret technique had eventually drowned in the river of time, and had completely vanished. Humph! Yishuan, nobody will be able to save you today. Pang Yongbo shouted. Then, he also broke into the group of thunder dragons. He held a thunder blade. This blade had a purple glow to it. The surrounding air diffused as he brandished his thunder blade. The space got shattered into small pieces. The thunder blade fell towards Yishuan's head. This was a fierce and ruthless attack. This child was arrogant. Nobody had ever humiliated him like this. So, he wanted to use Yishuan's blood to wash off his shame. Clang! It sounded as if two metals had collided. Yishuan's sword intention had rushed up from his hand, and had welcomed Pang Yongbo's attack. Bang! Yishuan's long sword swept down, and beheaded a thunder dragon. It might have been the most rampant type of dragon in the world. However, it appeared like a docile sheep in front of Yishuan. He continued to kill the thunder dragons one by one without facing any difficulty. Rumble, the long sword and the thunder blade collided ferociously in the void. A terrifying force swept out from the center of the collision, and shattered the entire space around the arena. A horrific storm swept across and obstructed everyone's vision. Bang! The loud scream of a young voice sounded, and a figure went flying upside down from inside the storm. Everyone looked attentively. It turned out to be Pang Yongbo. His young figure went flying up in the space with blood gushing out from his body. He had been sent flying by Yishuan's mighty strength. The storm dispersed. Yishuan stood in the center like an ancient god. A chill ran inside everyone. The truth of Yishuan's incredible body had appeared before the people of the Wind Dragon City for the first time. It was just as the rumors had stated. One could only defeat Yishuan by suppressing him with the help of some supreme magical power. Otherwise, fighting against his body was next to courting death. Even the Titan body didn't turn out to be his match. Yishuan had killed him after he had scared him to the point of madness. Yishuan brandished his sword again, and it killed several thunder dragons which were wandering about in a group. Then, a Han seal appeared above. A huge seal, made up entirely of stone, swept down from above like a huge mountain. Bang! Pang Yongbo was still flying in midair, but the Han seal caught up with him. It smashed down on his chest, and broke quite a few ribs. Then, he was pounded into the arena's floor. The impact formed a giant hole in the extremely hard floor of the arena. Pang Yongbo had been smashed into the arena. This had splattered the dust and gravels everywhere. The flow of battle had changed enormously. Everyone was dumbstruck at this sight. They hadn't anticipated that Pang Yongbo would be smashed into the arena by a seal technique. However, mere one mistake in his decision had given Yishuan an opportunity to display a brilliant counterattack. No, this couldn't even be regarded as a mistake on Pang Yongbo's part. An average person wouldn't have been able to deal with Pang Yongbo's surprise attack. However, it was his misfortune that Yishuan was his opponent. He was far inferior to Yishuan whether it was in fighting strength or the toughness of his body. Yishuan! Pang Yongbo roared. A horrifying power surged out from his body, and began to boil around him. Even his appearance had changed significantly. He no longer looked like a well-dressed youngster. Instead, He looked exceptionally miserable. His eyes had turned bloodshot. It seemed as if he was dying to kill Yi Shiwen, and would separate his bones from his muscles. His ominous facial expression frightened many people. One must know that this child wasn't internally the same as he appeared on the surface. He had never suffered such a defeat in his whole life. In fact, he had always bullied other people. How could have other people bullied him? His innate talent was on a whole different level. His cultivation speed was extremely quick. He had voyaged a pleasant journey thus far. He had obtained everything he had ever desired for. However, this time he had been defeated by Yi Shiwen, and this had shattered his ego. His frustration had transformed into anger, and it seemed if his rage would burn the heaven itself. A thunder dragon came out of his body. It roared and rushed towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. Its long tail opened a huge crack in the arena. Yi Shiwen saw that thunder dragon coming towards him. He snorted and said, "It's best for a child to be obedient and stay at home." An endless amount of golden light emerged from Yi Shiwen's hand. Then, this golden light went up to grab that thunder dragon. Bang! That thunder dragon's head was caught and crushed by Yi Shiwen's golden claw. The dragon transformed into a mass of energy, and was then absorbed by Yi Shiwen. It might have seemed like an extremely terrifying entity to the others. However, it was nothing in Yi Shiwen's eyes. After all, his gilded tyrant form had been gradually tempered by the heavenly tribulations. Yi Shiwen could casually walk into the group of thunder dragons, and could butcher them one by one with grace. Yi Shiwen suddenly heard Pang Yongbo's ferocious voice as soon as he killed this thunder dragon. "Yi Shiwen, die!" This immature voice was filled with bitter resentment. Yi Shiwen turned around, and saw that Pang Yongbo was condensing a secret seal technique in his hands at a very fast speed. He was concentrating the endless power of thunder and lightning in the middle of the arena. An extremely tall figure appeared in front of everyone's eyes. He appeared like an ancient god, and his entire body was brimming with lightning. It seemed as if he had been born in a sea of thunder and lightning. The thunder and lightning were at his beck and call. The endless power of thunder and lightning was being unleashed with each step which he took. He was spouting an overwhelming and godly power. This is Thunder God. This supreme magical power has been mentioned in the 9 Temples 5 Elements Thunder Book. It has been mentioned in the folklores that one can summon the Thunder God. I didn't expect that Pang Yongbo would have comprehended the 9 Temples 5 Elements Thunder Book to such extent at such a young age. This book has fallen into his hands, and has made him even more powerful. A knowledgeable expert recognized it, and spoke in astonishment. That's not right. It's not the real Thunder God. However, it's still quite dreadful. The Thunder God was one of the most terrifying gods in the ancient times. Yi Shiwen looked calm, but a solemn look had appeared on his face. He could feel an unprecedented suppression emerging from the phantom of the Thunder God. One must know that the Daos practiced by everyone had basically been established by 300 chaotic devil gods in the ancient times. These were known as 3,000 main Daos. And they eventually led one to the invincible Tao. Therefore, there were many power techniques which when practiced to the peak would allow the practitioner to summon the associated chaotic devil god. These techniques were considered ultimate because the original chaotic devil gods used to be powerful enough to deter the 10,000 worlds in the ancient times. They used to be extremely terrifying. The chaotic devil gods would have conquered the 10,000 worlds if they hadn't fallen in the ancient past. This secret technique basically allowed one to condense the spirit, essence and energy of a particular devil god. The phantom condensed would be extremely tyrannical even if it contained only a wisp of the original. The Thunder God used to be ranked near the top among the many devil gods. The Thunder God's thunder principle was considered unparalleled and incredible. Rumble. The Thunder God grew bigger and bigger in front of everyone. It grew more than 100 feet tall. It looked a bit blurred and unclear. However, it possessed a kind of incredible majesty. It held a thunder blade in its hand. Endless thunder and lightning condensed together, and swept down towards Yi Shiwen. It seemed like a mighty torrent of endless thunder and lightning had poured down. Yi Shiwen's left hand condensed a startling sword intention. He immediately swept out the buried earth sword technique. He simultaneously used his right hand to brandish the coiling dragon palm. He used the move, Hidden Dragon Rises from the Abyss. His right palm gave birth to a giant golden dragon. It roared and rushed up. Yi Shiwen had promptly exhibited 2 secret techniques, and had unleashed them thoroughly. Yi Shiwen's aura became exceptionally terrifying. This left everyone in astonishment. Bang! The 2 terrifying forces collided into each other. That ancient thunder god's offensive was successfully blocked. Both of Yi Shiwen's secret techniques had collaborated to fight against the lone thunder god. Rumble. A dreadful power swept across. The surrounding space couldn't withstand it, and collapsed. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.